Tonight's story begins in a distant era, one touched by courage, mystery, and the gentle rhythm of a world long gone. As you settle into this quiet moment, let the day drift away and allow this peaceful journey through history to guide you toward rest. Before you fall asleep, if these calm historical journeys bring you a sense of peace, consider subscribing so the next one reaches you softly right when you need it. And whenever you awaken, feel free to comment on the era or story you'd like to explore next. I'll create more gentle tales to support your good health and peaceful sleep.
The dust in Prosperity, Montana was a fine reddish-brown powder that coated everything. The false-fronted saloons, the unpainted lumber of the new general store, the starched collar of Elias Vance, and the very air he breathed. It was the dust of ambition, of haste, and of a history too recent to be truly buried. It was the summer of 1887. The air was thick with the scent of pine sap from the timber hauled in for the latest wave of construction, and the metallic tang of coal smoke from the Northern Pacific locomotive that had hauled Elias here. He stood on the raised wooden boardwalk that served as the town's main artery, a man carved from a softer stone than the granite of the nearby Rockies, yet carrying a weight that suggested a lifetime of hardening. Elias was a man in his late 30s, clean-shaven, with eyes the color of faded denim that observed the chaotic symphony of the frontier town with a practiced, weary patience. He wore a respectable, if travel-worn, worsted suit that marked him immediately as a figure of the East, or at least someone who intended to conduct business, not just dig for gold or rope cattle. Prosperity, the name painted in peeling black letters above the station master's office, was a lie and a promise at all once. It was a town born of the rail line and the rumor of silver, a boom town on the raw edge of civilization, where the mountains rose in jagged, blue-hazed masses, utterly indifferent to the human hustle below. For the men pouring off the train, land speculators, prospectors, displaced farmers, and the inevitable handful of sharp-eyed grifters, this was a new dawn. This was the place where old debts and worn-out names could be shed like snakeskins, and a new life could be staked out with a pickaxe and a deed. They saw the lumber mills screaming their promise on the outskirts, the telegraph wires strung taut across the endless sky, and the shimmering, distant promise of fortunes to be made. Elias saw it too, but he also saw the familiar dust. He saw the faces, the same desperate hunger he had seen in the ruined cities of the South after the war, the same quick, guarded glances of men who trusted nothing but the weight of the silver dollar in their pocket. He saw the hastily erected buildings, knowing the foundations were shallow, just like the loyalty of men chasing the next boom. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and touched the outline of a small leather-bound book, his only luggage of consequence. The action was automatic, a nervous tick of a man who knew the value of discretion. His destination was the Iron Horse Hotel, a 3-story brick structure that looked vastly out of place amid the wooden shacks, a monument to the town's inflated self-worth. The hotel lobby was a maelstrom of activity. A hurried clerk, slicked hair perpetually damp with sweat, barked room numbers. Men argued in loud, booming voices over maps laid out on a sparred mahogany counter, their fingers tracing lines of ore-bearing rock. The very air was an intoxicating blend of cigar smoke, cheap whiskey, and a palpable masculine excitement. Elias secured a modest room on the 3rd floor, paying with a crisp $20 bill. The clerk, noticing the quality of the note, gave him a moment of genuine interest before the frenzy claimed him again. "Just arrived, Mr. Vance. Elias Vance, from back east." "Welcome to Prosperity, Mr. Vance. Best advice I can give you. Hold on to your wallet and watch your claims. Everything here is for the taking, and everyone here is looking to take it." Elias simply nodded. The clerk's cynical welcome confirmed his deepest reservations. The frontier was supposed to be simpler, purer. In truth, it was merely the old world stripped bare, its naked greed exposed to the harsh sun. He climbed the creaking stairs, the floorboards complaining beneath his boots. His room was Spartan, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the main thoroughfare. As he set his bag down, he pulled back the gingham curtain. The street was a living tableau of this new, restless America. Chinese laborers, indispensable to the railroad, but scorned by the locals, shuffled past, their faces inscrutable beneath their wide hats. A group of heavily armed miners, fresh from the hills, were exchanging boisterous jokes with a woman of easy virtue, whose dress was a defiant splash of scarlet against the brown dust. Elias wasn't a stranger to rough landscapes or desperate men. His past, which he had carried like a lead weight for the last 10 years, had been forged in the unforgiving crucible of the Civil War. He had served, not as a soldier, but as a clerk, a logistics man, one who managed the monstrous ledger of death and supply for the Union Army. He had seen what war did to men's souls, how it taught them to see humanity as merely units on a balance sheet. The violence of prosperity was merely the peace version of that war, a relentless competitive drive to survive and thrive at any cost. His purpose in prosperity was not gold or land. It was a man named Silas Thorne. That evening, Elias walked the town, allowing the dust to settle on his suit, letting the noise of the saloons wash over him. He was a shadow, a passive observer in a town that demanded participation. He eventually stopped at the Last Chance Saloon. It was the largest and loudest establishment, a cathedral of vice, whose swinging doors seemed to exhale the combined heat of 100 bodies and the thin, tinny music of a piano player who hit more wrong notes than right. Inside, the light was the color of weak amber, filtering through smoky air. Elias ordered a rye whiskey, nursing it slowly by the bar, his back to the wall. He listened. The talk was all money. Land parcels in the mountains, the new vein of ore discovered in the widowmaker's claim, the stock market in New York City, which felt as distant as the moon, but whose invisible hand controlled the fortunes made in this dusty valley. Elias saw it too, but he also saw the familiar dust. He saw the faces, the same desperate hunger he had seen in the ruined cities of the South after the war, the same quick, guarded glances of men who trusted nothing but the weight of the silver dollar in their pocket. He saw the hastily erected buildings, knowing the foundations were shallow, just like the loyalty of men chasing the next boon. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and touched the outline of a small leather-bound book, his only luggage of consequence. Elias knew his town had to be here, but finding him would not be easy.
The teller swallowed hard. Mr. Thorne is the proprietor, sir. He only takes appointments from major investors. Tell him Elias Vance is here. He'll see me. The certainty in Elias's voice left no room for argument. A few minutes later, a heavy oak door marked proprietor opened, and a secretary, a stern woman in a severe black dress, beckoned him in. Silas Thorne was a man who looked every bit the master of his domain. He sat behind a large, clean mahogany desk, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair neatly parted. He had the robust build of a man who ate well and slept soundly, and his face held the practiced, benevolent smoothness of a pastor or a politician. He looked up, his expression shifting from a benign smile to one of instantaneous, cold shock. For a brief, telling moment, the air left the room. Elias, Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. The name was a stone dropped into a deep well, resonating with a shared, terrible past. Elias, replied, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch a declaration of finality. This was not a social call. This was the meeting of a reckoning. "I heard you had found God," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He noted the heavy Bible resting innocently on the corner of the desk, its pages undisturbed. "It appears he rewards piety generously in Montana." Thorne recovered quickly, the veneer of composure snapping back into place. He rose, extending a hand that Elias pointedly ignored. "Elias, I can't tell you the surprise, the pleasure. You should have written. I thought you were..." "Dead?" Elias finished for him. "Many people did. That was the point, wasn't it? To let the dust settle on everything?" Thorne leaned back against his desk, the benevolence gone, replaced with a glint of steel. "I am a new man, Elias. This is a new place. The past is not welcome here." "The past has a terrible habit of traveling," Elias countered, pulling the small, worn ledger from his coat. It was bound in dark leather, its edges softened by years of handling. He laid it on the desk. It wasn't a bank book. It was a wartime log. "The merchant's ledger," Elias whispered, his eyes never leaving Thorne's. "The one that tracked the other supplies, the ones that went missing, the ones we filed away as lost in transit, the ones that funded the first 4 years of your Reformation." This was the truth beneath prosperity's glittering surface. This was the familiar dust, the original sin of stolen resources and forged documents that had provided the capital for Silas Thorne's respectable, powerful life. The contents of that book, Silas, would not just ruin your reputation. It would see you hanged for treason. It would see this whole bank seized. It would turn prosperity into a ghost town overnight. Thorne's face was ashen, the smooth composure finally cracking. He looked not at the ledger, but at the window, at the bright, ambitious town he had built. He had fled the ruin of the war, convinced his secrets were safe beneath 1,000 miles of untamed land and a new, respected identity. "What do you want, Elias?" Thorne finally said, his voice stripped of its confidence, revealing the raw, desperate man underneath. "Money? Land? Name your price." Elias stepped closer to the desk, his eyes hard and cold. "I don't want your ill-gotten fortune, Silas. I want to know who else knew, who else got rich on the ledger's tally." He tapped the cover of the book. "The debt we owe is not to the army or the law, Silas. It's to the men who died, because their rations, their ammunition, their medical supplies never reached them. That debt is not paid with money. It's paid with truth. And you are going to help me find every name in this book." The sun, high now, streamed through the window, catching the fine, familiar dust motes dancing in the air of Silas Thorne's immaculate office. The dust of secrets unsettled, and a history that had come home to roost. The new dawn had arrived, but it had only illuminated the same old dark human flaw. And Elias Vance was here to rake through the ashes. The heavy oak door of Silas Thorne's office remained shut, sealing the two men in a sudden, brittle silence. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a low, simmering tension. Silas Thorne, the respected banker and pillar of prosperity, now looked like a man staring into a recently dug grave. He was sweating, despite the coolness of the bank, and his eyes, fixed on the ledger on his desk, held a desperate cunning. "You didn't come all this way just to blackmail me, Elias," Thorne finally said, his voice regaining a measure of its former authoritative rumble, though it was strained. "If it was money, you'd have named a sum and kept the book secret. This is personal. This is revenge." Elias Vance leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed, which only amplified the lethal seriousness of his intent. Revenge is a word for schoolboys, Silas. This is settlement. And yes, it is personal. Everything about that ledger is personal. He gestured to the worn leather binding. You remember what that book truly represented? It wasn't just supplies and coin. It was the lifeblood of men fighting and dying. And it was a pact between you, me, and a handful of others. You decided to cash out and run. I decided to stay and face the silence. Elias walked to the window, gazing out at the chaotic energy of prosperity. He found your new dawn here. You built your empire on the gold you earned by ensuring that certain wagons never reached the front lines. But for me, the war never ended. I just moved the battlefield. Elias's personal burden, his fading echo of the old world, was the relentless memory of the war and his inescapable role in the dark dealings Thorne had now brought to the forefront. His heritage was quiet, scholarly. Born in rural New England, Elias had been trained as a junior archivist before the war, a man whose passion was for the precision of data and the truth held within documents. When the conflict began, his meticulous mind and flawless penmanship were deemed more valuable in the administrative offices than on the firing lines. He was assigned to a massive Union supply depot near Manassas, Virginia. It was there he met Silas Thorne, then a quartermaster, with an uncanny mixture of pious fervor and relentless ambition. Thorne was the orchestrator. Elias was the key. Elias was the one who could make things disappear. I remember every entry, Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet cutting through the room's tension. October 1863, entry 421, 300 blankets and 2 crates of quinine, designated for the regiments at Cold Harbor. You marked them destroyed by rebel raiders. They weren't destroyed. They were sold for gold coin to a blockade runner in Norfolk. Elias turned back to Thorne. Your heritage, Silas, is a belief in order, in accountability. I signed those false manifests. I wrote the numbers. I knew that every scratch of my pen meant a man on the front lines would shiver through the night or die from the fever that quinine could have cured. That is the familiar dust that follows me. I may not have pulled a trigger, but I am complicit in the death of better men. Thorne shifted nervously. We all had to survive, Elias. The war made devils of us all. I took an opportunity to protect my future. That's what ambition is. You just sat there judging. I didn't judge then. I was too afraid of the gallows myself, Elias admitted, a raw flicker of shame crossing his face. But afterward, I couldn't reconcile the ledger in my mind. You took your profit and became a respectable banker. I took my profit, my life, and found it hollow. I spent 10 years in the shadows, trying to outrun the numbers I wrote. Elias's hunt was rooted in the core historical context of the post-Civil War American experience. While the official fighting had ended, the nation was still wrestling with Reconstruction, economic upheaval, and a deeply felt sense of moral injury. The boom in the West, in towns like Prosperity, was partially funded by the same dark money that had flowed freely during the war.
Fortunes were made, identities were changed, and the sins of the East were simply transported west of the Mississippi and given a new, respectable name. The ledger was proof that the moral decay of the war was not confined to the battlefields. It was the foundation of the new economy. So you're a missionary now, Thorne scoffed, regaining a sliver of confidence. You've come to Prosperity to baptize the West in your guilt? I'm here to find the others, the names listed in the second half of that book, Elias stated simply. He pointed a finger at Thorne. We were all complicit.
But you were the architect. I need the truth, Silas, because those men, the other ledger holders, are still out there, hiding behind new names, still controlling things. They are the true, enduring echo of the old world. And until I settle the debt for those entries, my own soul remains mortgaged. Thorn's fear began to morph into calculation. He was trapped, but perhaps not defeated. "You need me, Elias," Thorn whispered. "That ledger alone is just a logbook. I have the contacts. I know how the money was laundered, through land speculation and early railroad shares. You won't get a name out of those pages without my knowledge of the coded transfers." Elias nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I know. That's why you're not in handcuffs right now. But let's be clear. You are not my partner. You are my asset. If you try to run, if you try to warn anyone, or if I find one more drop of blood on your hands, I will expose you, and I will enjoy the fall." Thorn stared at the man he had once thought of as a harmless, meticulous fool. Elias was different now, hollowed out and sharpened by years of self-imposed exile and guilt. "Very well," Thorn said, defeat heavy in his voice. He walked to a fireproof safe hidden behind a framed portrait of George Washington, a fitting irony. He spun the heavy dial and retrieved a handful of documents, stock certificates, land deeds, and a heavily annotated map of the Montana Territory. The largest names, the ones who took the biggest cuts of the special inventory, they didn't stay in the railroad business. They moved into land. They are financing the expansion of the territory, ensuring they control the resources before the government can properly survey the area. He smoothed out the map on his desk. 2 names, Elias, the biggest of the lot. They were quartermasters, higher up than us. They saw a future where the West was divided, controlled not by politicians, but by capital. The capital we provided to them. One, Marcus Kincaid. He bought up vast tracts of timberland. He's running the largest lumber mills in the territory, supplying every growing town from here to the coast. He's the one controlling the price of the very wood that builds prosperity. He operates near the Flathead Reservation. He calls himself a timber baron. Josephine Hayes. He hesitated before naming her, a flicker of genuine apprehension in his eyes. She was the silent partner always. She handled the transport logistics, the one with the actual military connections. She's not here in Montana, but in Wyoming. She's financing a private railway extension and consolidating mineral rights. She's the most dangerous of all. She has the discipline of a field commander and the cruelty of a tax collector. Elias's gaze sharpened. The task was suddenly immense, far larger than simply exposing a local banker. It involved confronting the very arteries of power in the New West. The echo of the old world wasn't just fading, it was actively shaping the new one. Kincaid, Elias decided. He is local. We start with the nearest echo. Thorn opened a drawer and slid a small silver-plated pistol across the desk. "You'll need this, Elias. These men aren't clerks. They've tasted power. They won't surrender a dime or a truth without a fight." Elias pushed the gun back. "I don't kill. I expose. My weapon is the truth, written in ink, not in lead. It's what I have always done best." But the realization was stark. His past as a desk-bound archivist was inadequate for this new war. He was a man of ledgers, stepping into a world of lumberjacks and ruthless financiers. The fading echo was about to collide with the raw, brutal reality of the American frontier. He looked at Thorn, not with contempt, but with a cold recognition of their shared moral wreckage. "You will stay here. You will continue to run your bank. Act exactly as you have been. You are my eyes and ears in prosperity. If Kincaid or Hayes discovers I am asking questions, they will come for you first. Your safety depends entirely on my success. Do you understand?" Thorn swallowed and nodded stiffly. "I understand, Elias. May God forgive us both." Elias picked up the ledger, placing it carefully back inside his coat. As he walked out of the bank and back into the dusty street, the noise of the boomtown seemed deafening. He was no longer running from his past. He was actively dragging it into the light. He carried the weight of those stolen supplies, the silent testament to the thousands of forgotten dead, and the knowledge that the West, supposedly a clean slate, was already poisoned by the same corruption that had consumed the East. He had started as a man trying to run from his heritage of failure. Now he was embracing it, using his meticulous eye for detail to dismantle the fortunes built on that very failure. Elias Vance, the archivist of death, was finally ready to settle the accounts of the old world. His new destination? The timber camps of Marcus Kincaid, the first of the ghosts he needed to lay to rest. The road out of prosperity was less a road than a pair of dusty ruts carved deep by the endless procession of lumber wagons heading toward the Flathead region. Elias hired a sputtering, worn-out buckboard and a driver, a taciturn older man named Clay, who seemed to view the vast Montana landscape with a mixture of reverence and resignation. Clay was the perfect companion, silent, observant, and completely uninterested in his passenger's business. As the town receded into a smudge of brown and gray on the horizon, Elias finally felt the air lift off his chest. The confrontation with Silas Thorn was a victory, but a terrifyingly incomplete one. Thorn was subdued, a trapped animal, but the truth remained. Elias was one man against an entrenched network of power. His only advantage was the leverage held within the very item he guarded. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the small leather-bound book that had been the pivot of his existence for over a decade. The merchant's ledger was unremarkable in appearance, about the size of a man's hand. It had a worn, water-stained cover and pages filled with the elegant, precise copperplate handwriting that Elias himself had perfected during his brief career as an archivist. But the entries held more power than any deed to a mine or rail company. It was not the official Union supply log. That ledger, managed by Silas Thorn, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deception, filled with carefully calculated entries that masked the theft of millions of dollars worth of goods. This book was the secret ledger, the one Elias had maintained privately, a meticulous, cross-referenced record of the true fate of the lost supplies and the precise recipients of the profits. Elias opened it to a random page. Entry 78, 15 October 1864, 400 cases ammunition, caliber .58. Destination, General Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah. Actual recipient, Baltimore buyer. Name coded as MK. Consideration, $8,000 US payable in gold coin. The names were coded, the amounts specific, and the dates heartbreakingly precise. They were all linked to crucial moments in the war, battles where shortages had led to devastating losses. Elias's hand, resting on the page, trembled not from fear, but from the chill of memory. This ledger was the inciting incident that drove his entire existence. It was not just a record of theft, it was the documented proof of the secret debt they all owed. Elias's debt was his complicity, Thorn's debt was his profit, and the debts of Marcus Kincaid and Josephine Hayes were their entire fortunes. The primary conflict for Elias was not simply catching the criminals. It was the moral paradox of his pursuit. He needed the ledger to destroy their power, but holding it made him as guilty as they were. His pursuit was his long, painful path to redemption. "Why the long face, friend?" Clay asked, without looking away from the mules. "You look like you're carrying a church on your back."
Elias closed the ledger quickly. "Just counting old sins, Clay. Trying to figure out the final tally. Sins don't tally. They linger. the driver observed sagely.
The only way to pay for one is to do something decent with the rest of your life. Can't unring a bell.
Clay's simple wisdom struck Elias hard. He couldn't unring the bell, but he could silence the echoes. He had to expose Kincaid, not just because Kincaid was rich, but because Kincaid's continued success was a direct insult to the memory of the soldiers who had starved or died due to that $8,000 transaction. The secret debt was not financial, it was existential. The codes within the ledger were a testament to the old relationship between Thorne and Elias. They had devised a shorthand to hide their tracks from their superiors, but now only Thorne and Elias truly understood the full context. Thorne had confirmed that MK was indeed Marcus Kincaid, now the timber baron. Kincaid's operation, the Flathead Timber Concern, was massive. It lay 60 miles north, an industrial scar carved into the majestic forests. He had used his initial capital, the profits from the stolen war supplies, to buy up vast, inaccessible tracts of land for pennies on the dollar after the war. Now, with the railroad opening the market, Kincaid was a monopoly, selling lumber to build the very new dawn towns like Prosperity. Elias realized the true weight of the debt. Kincaid wasn't just hoarding money, he was warping the landscape, both physical and moral, with his ill-gotten gains. They reached the timber country late on the third day. The scent of pine was replaced by the acrid, metallic smell of sawdust and sweat. The camp was a sprawling, rough settlement, shacks for the workers, a single dominant main office, and the incessant scream of the steam-powered saws. Elias dismissed Clay, telling him to wait in the nearest town, promising him a generous sum for his silence and patience. He walked into the camp alone, an anomaly in his city suit and starched collar. He sought out the main office, a large two-story structure built, ironically, from Kincaid's own high-quality pine. The air inside was warm, the walls lined with maps, and the floor littered with manifests. Marcus Kincaid was the antithesis of the smooth banking Thorne. He was huge, with hands the size of shovels and a face permanently etched by sun and exertion. He wore rough but expensive woolens, and his confidence was not the slick kind, but the blunt, territorial assurance of a bear in his own woods. "You're lost, city man," he rumbled, not looking up from a massive map spread across his desk. "This isn't a place for speculators in fine tailoring." "I'm not speculating, Mr. Kincaid. I'm collecting on an old account." Elias stepped forward. Kincaid finally looked up, his eyes a cold, startling blue. He recognized the type of man Elias was, intelligent, out of place, and clearly carrying a grievance. "I don't deal in bad debts. You want work, look elsewhere. You want to buy wood? See the foreman." Elias reached into his coat, but instead of the ledger, he pulled out a single, heavily creased piece of paper. It was a receipt, a genuine Union receipt for medical supplies, dated October 15, 1864, the same date as entry 78. "I'm here about the quinine, Marcus," Elias said, using Kincaid's first name deliberately. 300 units, specifically. They were supposed to go to a field hospital outside Richmond. They never arrived. Kincaid's demeanor shifted instantly. The raw confidence vanished, replaced by a chilling stillness. The air in the room seemed to compress. He didn't deny it. He didn't question how Elias knew. He just stared. "That's ancient history, Vance," he snarled, his voice losing his rough charm and hardening into something venomous. "History lives as long as the men who profited from it," Elias countered. He laid the receipt on the desk, precisely centered on Kincaid's map. "I know about the quinine, the blankets,
and the 400 cases of .58 caliber ammunition you redirected. I know the money from that sale was the first deposit in your company's original account, and I know you, Silas Thorne, and Josephine Hayes were all signatories on the original agreement. The secret debt was now officially activated. Kincaid, unlike Thorne, was a man of action, not ledgers. He understood threat, not negotiation. You came here 60 miles into my territory to threaten me with a piece of old paper? Kincaid slowly rose from his chair, his considerable size dominating the small office. I came here to deliver a message, Elias replied calmly. Silas Thorne is already aware that the ledger still exists. It tracks every transaction from 63 to 65. I have the location of every name on the list, and I am going to expose all of you. You will lose this mill, you will lose your fortune, and you will face the reckoning you avoided 10 years ago. Kincaid walked around the desk, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He stopped directly in front of Elias, his shadow enveloping the archivist. Thorne, he scoffed. I knew he was soft. Always worried about his soul. You made a mistake coming to me first, Vance. Thorne would beg. Hayes will calculate. I eliminate. Kincaid reached out a huge calloused hand, not for Elias, but for the receipt on the desk. Elias instinctively slammed his hand down over the paper, protecting the single link to the ledger. That was all the excuse Kincaid needed. The blow came fast and brutal, a backhand meant not to incapacitate, but to damage. Elias staggered back, crashing into a small filing cabinet, the searing pain exploding in his cheek and jaw. The secret archivist was no match for the lumber baron. Kincaid advanced, his eyes blazing with fury. You think you can play the moral arbiter, you damn book clerk? We built this country. We took the risks. The supplies were going to waste anyway. We created jobs. We built prosperity. You built it on stolen graves, Elias spat out, wiping a streak of blood from his mouth. He held the receipt tightly, instinctively shielding the location of the main ledger. The ensuing fight was short and one-sided, a brutal clash between brute force and desperate survival. Kincaid, energized by the threat to his empire, slammed Elias against the wall, reaching for the receipt. Elias fought back with the only weapons he had, surprise and precision. As Kincaid lunged, he managed to wrench open the filing cabinet and smash Kincaid's chin with the sharp corner of a drawer. Kincaid roared, momentarily stunned. Elias used the precious few seconds, slipping out from under the giant's grasp and scrambling for the door. You won't leave this camp alive, Vance, Kincaid yelled, recovering quickly and lunging across the desk. Elias burst out of the office, drawing the attention of the surrounding workers, tough, scarred men who instinctively sided with their boss. The inciting incident had now escalated into a full-blown conflict. Elias was no longer a ghost. He was a living, bleeding threat. He ran, the pain in his jaw a burning reminder of the price of his moral crusade. He clutched the single piece of evidence that tied Kincaid to the merchant's ledger. He had delivered his message, and the secret debt was now officially in collection. The chase was on, and Elias Vance was a long, desperate way from his quiet life of ledgers. His redemption would have to be earned not by accounting, but by survival. The mule-drawn buckboard was a jarring, painful conveyance, but it was Elias Vance's salvation. He had found Clay, the driver, precisely where he had left him, nursing a lukewarm coffee in a dusty saloon in the nearest whistle-stop town. Elias's cheek was already swelling, darkening to a purple bruise that starkly contrasted with his pale, blood-flecked collar. You look like you argued with a bear and lost, friend, Clay observed, his eyes steady on the swelling.
Worse, Elias rasped, his jaw stiff.
I argued with a man who thinks he's an emperor. I need you to take me to the nearest major rail connection, south to Wyoming. Clay simply nodded, accepting the new destination and the obvious trouble Elias was in with the weary detachment of someone who had seen too much of the West's swift justice. He was paid in advance with a fistful of gold eagles, enough to secure his silence and cooperation. The journey south was a blur of high plains and endless sky. Elias spent the days clutching his secret ledger, his focus split between the throbbing pain in his jaw and the urgent need to plan his next move. The railroad was the true architect of the Western boom, a literal iron spine connecting the decaying morality of the East with the raw ambition of the frontier. Elias understood that the rail lines were not just tracks, they were the channels through which Kincaid and Thorne had funneled their stolen capital. To pursue Josephine Hayes, he had to embrace the very mechanism of their corruption, the rails. Their destination was Cheyenne, Wyoming, a city far larger and more established than Prosperity, a major hub where the Union Pacific met the Denver Pacific, and where the forces of finance truly governed the land. If Prosperity was Kincaid's rough, lumber-made fiefdom, Cheyenne was Josephine Hayes's gilded, steel-laced dominion. The move expanded the world of the story significantly. Montana was a place of resource extraction, lumber and silver. Wyoming, particularly Cheyenne, was a place of pure capital and logistics. This shift introduced a far more sophisticated, strategic level of villainy than the brute force of Marcus Kincaid. Elias knew he was stepping onto a more dangerous stage. Kincaid had reacted with animal rage. Hayes would react with cold, calculating efficiency. As they approached the main line and finally exchanged the buckboard for a stifling, overcrowded passenger coach, Elias settled in, pulling his small ledger out again. The codes now seemed clearer. Hayes's coded name, J.H., was linked to early purchases of rolling stock and contracts for surveying land ahead of the official Union Pacific expansion. He found a specific entry that sent a chill through him. Entry 112, February 1865. 20 kegs of gunpowder, designated for demolition work near Petersburg. Actual recipient, J.H. Consideration, used to purchase control of the Red Rock stage line and acquire key telegraph patents. Hayes had not just funded a company, she had strategically purchased the infrastructure of communication and movement in the nascent West. She was playing chess, while Thorne and Kincaid were merely flipping coins. This was not just a journey across the rails, it was a move from the wilderness into the very heart of the American industrial machine. Elias knew he couldn't confront Hayes like he had Kincaid. A physical fight was impossible, and Hayes, unlike the two men, had no visible public face of crime like a fraudulent bank or a violent timber camp. She was a silent financier, moving capital like a phantom. His challenge lay in understanding how a woman, in the highly restrictive business world of the 1880s, had acquired such untouchable power. His current situation offered a grim lesson. He needed help. He realized that his attempt to be a lone avenger was naive. The war had taught him the necessity of logistics, of alliances, however temporary. He needed a local contact, someone who understood the financial architecture of Cheyenne and could move within the social circles Hayes undoubtedly controlled. He remembered a minor name from his past, Caleb Thorne, Silas's younger cousin, a bright, idealistic man whom Silas had tried and failed to corrupt during the war. Caleb had become a low-level clerk for the Union Pacific, seeking a career far away from his family's moral taint. Elias had heard he was working in the Cheyenne rail yards.
This meant a huge risk, trusting a relative of the man he was currently blackmailing. But Caleb was an echo from the old world that Elias believed was still pure. Cheyenne was a shock after the dust and grit of Montana. It was a sprawling, booming metropolis built entirely on the cattle and rail industries. The streets were paved, the buildings were limestone and granite, and the air hummed with the noise of commerce. Stockyard auctions, printing presses, and the rhythmic clang of rail cars being assembled. It looked like the promised land of the American dream: stability, wealth, and order. Elias checked into a boarding house, far from the opulent hotels downtown. He knew Hayes would have eyes and ears everywhere. His face, still bruised and swollen, was his liability. He needed to disappear into the bureaucracy. He spent the first day watching the vast Union Pacific yard. It was a dizzying maze of tracks, engines, and cargo, the very lifeblood of the West. He finally found Caleb Thorne in a cluttered, paint-spattered office, meticulously checking manifests. Caleb was in his late 20s, thin and scholarly, with the same nervous energy as his cousin, but channeled into meticulous work. He looked up, recognizing the gaunt face and intense eyes instantly. "Elias Vance? I thought you were a myth," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the open door. "I'm no myth, Caleb. I'm an invoice long past due," Elias said, wincing as he spoke. Caleb ushered him into the small office, locking the door. "What do you want? And why do you look like you were hit by a freight train?" Elias skipped the pleasantries and laid the raw truth out: Silas's wealth, the ledger, Kincaid's violence, and his true mission to find every man who profited from the war and return the capital to the public trust. Caleb listened, his face moving from skepticism to horrified confirmation as Elias mentioned the specific coded entries in the secret log. "Silas tried to get me involved, you know," Caleb said softly, looking sickened. "He called it patriotic reallocation of resources. I refused. I came west hoping to build something clean, something real. But if he, Kincaid, and Hayes are involved, then the whole foundation of this promised land is rotten." "It is," Elias confirmed, "and that rottenness is centered right here, in Cheyenne, in the operations of Josephine Hayes. She is too powerful to approach directly. I need an opening, Caleb. I need to understand her operation from the inside." Caleb became Elias's unexpected, necessary ally. He explained Josephine Hayes' subtle genius. She was not a public figure. She operated through a trust, the Wyoming Transportation Syndicate, which legally owned dozens of smaller companies, telegraph, stage lines, and crucially, the rights to lay spur lines off the main Union Pacific track. Hayes didn't own the Union Pacific, but she controlled its arteries. She forced towns that needed a rail connection to use her spur lines, and she charged exorbitant fees. She controlled movement and communication. That gunpowder money you talked about, it bought her the strategic high ground. The new challenge was clear. To expose Hayes, he needed proof that her legitimate business, the syndicate, was financed by stolen military supplies. He needed to link the ledger's initial capital directly to the syndicate's current assets. Caleb provided the solution. The syndicate is preparing to bid on a massive federal contract, the construction of a new line connecting Cheyenne to Denver. They need a perfect financial record. I am a clerk. I can access the preliminary audit files. They're stored at the Union Pacific Legal Annex downtown. "That's illegal, Caleb. It's theft," Elias pointed out, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's accountability," Caleb countered, echoing Elias's earlier sentiment. You said the debt must be settled with truth. I will get you the files showing the syndicate's founding capital. If the numbers match the ledger, it's irrefutable proof of her origin. The plan was set. Caleb would secure the financial records, providing the hard evidence Elias needed to expose Hayes and dismantle the syndicate.
The legal annex was a formidable, secure building near the Cheyenne courthouse. Elias, relying on Caleb's knowledge of the Union Pacific security rotation, spent a night hiding in the shadows, waiting for his opportunity. Caleb, using his key and his employee's status, managed to slip into the building unchallenged. Elias waited, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs, the bruised side of his face numb with tension. He was once again relying on the meticulous knowledge of an archivist to fight a physical war. When Caleb finally emerged, he was frantic, clutching a thick bundle of documents. "We have it, Elias. The initial capitalization documents. It's all here. The dates match the ledger perfectly." But as Caleb spoke, a large black carriage, drawn by two sleek horses, pulled up silently to the curb. A stern-faced man in a tailored dark coat stepped out, followed by two burly guards. "Hold him," the man's voice commanded. It was smooth, devoid of emotion, and utterly terrifying. Hayes hadn't waited for an open confrontation. She had eyes and ears within the Union Pacific, and she had anticipated that someone, perhaps Thorne, perhaps an ally, would eventually attempt to compromise her records. Elias and Caleb ran. They tore down an alleyway, scattering garbage cans and startling stray dogs. Hayes's men were fast and efficient. They were not Kincaid's rough lumberjacks. They were professional enforcers, and they were closing the gap. "The files, Elias! Take them! I'll draw them off!" Caleb yelled, shoving the bundle of papers into Elias's hands. Caleb deliberately cut left, running toward the open, noisy expanse of the rail yard, shouting a decoy cry. Elias, knowing this was Caleb's act of atonement for his cousin's sins, swallowed his protest and dove into the shadowed maze of stacked rail ties and towering freight cars. The sound of a single sharp gunshot echoed through the night. It wasn't aimed at Elias, but it served its purpose, a warning, a silencing. Elias clutched the financial records in his personal ledger to his chest, scrambling up onto a slow-moving flat car carrying stacks of freshly milled lumber. Kincaid's lumber, ironically. The train was heading south, away from the city, away from the immediate threat. He lay low amidst the pine, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. He had the files, the proof that would finally tie the secret debt to the promised land of Cheyenne. But the cost was devastating. Caleb had paid the true price for the information, becoming another casualty of the long overdue accounting. He stared up at the vast, uncaring Wyoming sky. He was now a fugitive on a moving rail car, holding the destiny of the entire Western economy in his hands. The journey across the rails had expanded his world, but the new challenge was survival, and the stakes had just been raised with the blood of an innocent man. The secret was out. Josephine Hayes knew he was coming. Elias Vance was a fugitive on a coal train. He lay motionless on a flat car stacked high with Kincaid's lumber, the rough, fragrant wood pressing against his bruised body. The train rattled south, its rhythmic iron drumming a relentless percussion against the cold dread of his mission. He had escaped Cheyenne with the proof he needed, Josephine Hayes's syndicate financial documents. But the cost, the presumed capture, or worse of Caleb Thorne, was a crushing weight. He knew Hayes's men would be searching every station and every northbound train. He couldn't risk a public depot. When the train finally slowed to take on water near a desolate, unnamed tank in the middle of the prairie,
Elias slipped off, disappearing into the vast, darkening landscape. He was alone, injured, and carrying two fragile, incriminating bundles, his personal merchant's ledger and the syndicate files. He needed to disseminate the information, to publish the truth before Hayes or Kincaid could silence him completely. But how? He was a meticulous clerk, not a journalist, and the legitimate press in the West was almost entirely owned or controlled by the very people he sought to expose. Elias walked for hours until he found a derelict, half-sunken sod house, a relic of an earlier failed attempt at homesteading. He rested there, tending to his injuries. The swelling on his face had begun to recede, but the ache of guilt over Caleb was sharp and constant. He unrolled the syndicate files. They were complex, dense, and coded in the high language of financial law, but the fundamental truth was there. The starting capital, listed under a series of shell companies, matched the figures Elias had meticulously recorded in his ledger from the sale of stolen military goods. Hayes hadn't laundered the money. She had simply given it a legal disguise. This was irrefutable proof, but it was too intricate for a common newspaper article. It needed to be presented, argued, and disseminated through a channel that could pierce the armor of Hayes's legal and financial power. Elias had been dimly aware of a series of radical, anonymous pamphlets that had begun circulating in the frontier towns over the past few months. They appeared suddenly, slipped under doors and tacked to posts, usually in the dead of night. They were meticulously researched and bitingly critical of the new industrial barons, exposing instances of land theft, labor abuses, and corporate greed that the major papers refused to touch. The author was only known by the cryptic signature, The Cinder. The pamphlets were beautifully written, utilizing both sharp rhetoric and occasionally lyrical poetry, hence the moniker, The Ballad. Elias had dismissed them as the work of a disgruntled activist, but now staring at the complex evidence in his hands, he realized the Cinder was the only one who had both the courage and the precision to handle this truth. Elias needed to find this anonymous voice, and his only lead was the pamphlets themselves. He pulled a few scraps of the paper he had collected in prosperity from his pocket. He scrutinized the typesetting and the paper quality. The paper was a rare blend, slightly thicker than standard newsprint, with a distinctive blue-gray tint that Elias, with his archivist's eye, recognized. It wasn't local. The typeface, too, was an older style, a Caseland type, not commonly used by the large modern Western presses. This was a printing press from an older era, likely transported west by wagon, a relic. He remembered seeing a press that matched this description in the back room of a small, struggling bookbinder and publisher named Mrs. Ada Sterling in a remote mining town called Orem, a town far enough off the main rail line that Hayes's agents would be less likely to frequent it. Elias had visited Orem years ago during his period of self-imposed exile, trying to lose himself in the high desert. Elias needed to trust his instincts and his specialized knowledge of paper and print. The old world of meticulous detail, the heritage he had tried to escape, was now his greatest asset. The journey to Orem was slow and arduous, undertaken mostly on foot and occasionally by bribing teamsters hauling freight. When Orem's arrived, the town was a desolate cluster of wood and rock, nestled deep in the harsh mountains. The bookbinder's shop, Sterling Bindery, was on a side street, small and perpetually dusty. A faint, sweet scent of leather and glue hung in the air. Mrs. Sterling was a woman in her early 50s, with calloused hands and a pair of spectacles perched on her nose. She had a kind, firm face lined by years of hard work. When Elias, bruised and travel-worn, entered, she didn't show fear, only a steady, measured curiosity. "You're looking for a book or a repair?" she asked, her voice low and surprisingly strong. "Neither, ma'am," Elias said, his voice quiet. He pulled out the fragment of the anonymous pamphlet. "I'm looking for the owner of this press." Ada Sterling looked at the paper, then at Elias's face, tracing the lines of the bruise with her gaze. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, narrowed slightly. "That's trash paper, sir. Common agitator's nonsense. I only deal in quality binding."
Elias didn't press. Instead, he pulled out his ledger and the syndicate files. He laid them side by side on her counter, documents of two different lives, one secret, one public, united by the same crime. "I have the final pages for the Cinder's next ballad, ma'am," Elias whispered. "The ballad of Marcus Kincaid, Silas Thorne, and Josephine Hayes. It is a story of treason, war profiteering, and how the foundations of every town in this region are built on stolen supplies meant for dying soldiers." He pointed to the two sets of documents. "This is the hidden information. The Cinder already has the courage. I have the documentation. I only need the press." Ada Sterling looked down at the documents, her hands that knew how to stitch and glue and preserve, now resting lightly on the secrets. A long silence stretched between them, heavy with risk. Finally, she sighed. "The press is in the back, and you're right, it is an old Caslon press. It was my husband's. He had a great belief in the printed word." She met his gaze, the kindness in her eyes replaced by a burning, resolute conviction. "My husband also died in the war, Mr. Vance, Elias Vance. Mr. Vance, he died of fever in a field hospital that was mysteriously short of quinine. Tell me what is in that document that you call a ballad, and let me decide if I want to sing it." Elias spent the next 6 hours in the back room of the bindery, an environment of paper, ink, and meticulous order that felt to the archivist like home. He carefully detailed the contents of the ledger and the syndicate files, explaining the coded names, the supply shortages, and the exact match between the initial stolen capital and Hayes's modern-day empire. Ada Sterling didn't interrupt. She took notes, her handwriting swift and economical. Her shock was palpable, but quickly replaced by a furious determination. "They didn't just steal money, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice shaking with quiet rage. "They stole the opportunity for my husband to live. They stole the foundation of this country. They sold the victory for profit." She became the crucial ally Elias desperately needed. She was the Cinder. Her husband had been a journalist who died in the war, and she had taken his antique press and his passion for truth west, determined to expose the corruption she knew was festering beneath the surface of the Promised Land. "I cannot just print the ledger and the files, Mr. Vance. It's too dense. It needs a narrative, a ballad. We will write a series of pamphlets, each one exposing a different layer of the rot. 1. Phase 1, The Incitement, a pamphlet focused solely on Marcus Kincaid, using the quinine and ammunition thefts, entry 78, to detail how the timber baron's original capital directly cost soldiers' lives. This will drive a wedge between Kincaid and the common men he employs. 2. Phase 2, The Infrastructure, a pamphlet focused on Silas Thorne and his bank, exposing the laundering of the money and demonstrating how the stolen capital was disguised as legitimate loans, thus tainting every respectable business in prosperity. 3. Phase 3, The System, the final, largest pamphlet targeting Josephine Hayes and the syndicate. It will use the financial documents to show how treasonous war profiteering laid the foundation for her monopoly on rail, telegraph, and land.
We need to strike them all at once, Ada declared, her eyes burning with the zeal of the righteous. If we hit Kincaid and Thorne first, Hayes will have time to move her assets. No, we prepare all three and we distribute them across 3 states on the same night. Elias, the archivist, had the documents. Ada, the sender, had the voice and the distribution network. A loose, anonymous collection of sympathetic miners, rail workers, and shopkeepers who resented the stranglehold of the industrial barons. Over the next week, hiding in the safety of the bindery, Elias and Ada worked. Elias provided the precise facts, dates, and figures. Ada translated them into a powerful, accessible narrative. The old press began to run, slowly and methodically, churning out thousands of pamphlets, the final reckoning of the secret debt. On the final night, Elias, his face nearly healed, stood beside Ada as the last stack of pamphlets rolled off the press. She had crafted a devastating final paragraph for the Hayes pamphlet, a lyrical condemnation that captured the hypocrisy of the Gilded Age. The prosperity you see is a lie. The steel rails are built upon the moral wreckage of a war, and the man you pray beside every Sunday has blood on his hands. The cinder has merely lit the match. It is for the people to decide if they will let the fire burn the rot clean. The ledger is now open for all to read. Elias looked at the stack of paper, knowing that this was his redemption. He hadn't killed or fought. He had used his original skill, the management of truth, to wage a new war. As the first faint light of dawn painted the mountaintops, Ada looked at Elias. My network is ready. The pamphlets will be distributed tonight, on every corner, in every saloon, along every rail line from Montana to Wyoming. And what happens when Hayes and Kincaid realize who the cinder is? Elias asked. Ada smiled, a fierce, unapologetic expression. They will be too busy fighting the fire. And as for me, Mr. Vance, the truth is my shield. But I believe you still have the original ledger and the syndicate files. Yes, they are safer now, because the truth is about to become public, Elias said, placing the 2 fragile books back into his coat. Good, because those men won't stop until they silence the source, not just the echo. Now, you need to disappear again, Mr. Vance, and wait for the fire to catch. Elias Vance, the solitary archivist, was now tethered to a powerful, crucial ally, the anonymous voice. The ballad of the anonymous voice was ready to be sung, and the echoes of the old world were about to become the thunder of the new. The pamphlets were unleashed upon the Western Territories under the deep cover of a moonless night. From Montana timber camps to the bustling stockyards of Wyoming, the ballad of the anonymous voice was distributed by Ada Sterling's quiet network of dissidents. They were tucked under saloon doors, slipped into the mail slots of bank ledgers, and plastered onto the sides of telegraph poles. The third, most damning pamphlet, detailing Josephine Hayes's corruption, was tacked prominently on the notice board outside the Union Pacific Station in Cheyenne, a defiant strike at the heart of her empire. Elias Vance, having left Orem, was riding a borrowed horse toward a tiny, isolated whistle stop named Junction 17. He carried the precious ledger and the syndicate files, waiting for the inevitable detonation. The iron horse, the steam locomotive, was the central nervous system of the West in 1887. It was the technological marvel that dictated commerce, communication, and power. It had built the empires of Kincaid by hauling his lumber, Thorne by financing the rail's expansion, and especially Hayes by controlling the spur lines and logistics. Now Elias and Ada were attempting to use that same system against them. The immediate impact of the pamphlet's release was measured by the speed of the technology that opposed it, the telegraph. Within hours of the pamphlets being discovered at dawn, a frantic wave of telegraph messages began to spiderweb across the continent. Josephine Hayes, accustomed to absolute control, mobilized her vast resources instantly. Elias knew the drill. The first thing a powerful figure does when threatened is to seize control of the narrative and the lines of communication.
He stopped at the small, one-room telegraph office at Junction 17. The operator, a nervous young man, was already sweating, frantically sending and receiving messages. "What's the traffic like today?" Elias asked, feigning casual interest. "Madness, sir. Pure madness," the operator replied, not looking up from his key. "All private traffic, coded. Seems a high-level security incident. Messages coming from Cheyenne and going straight to Kincaid's offices in Montana. Everything marked urgent, executive security." Elias understood. Hayes wasn't using the regular channels. She was employing the private coded lines she had purchased with the stolen gunpowder money. Beneath the gaze of the Iron Horse, the technological change of the era, the speed of electricity, was now being deployed as a weapon of defense. He overheard a fragment of a decoded message the operator was transcribing. Quote, "Must intercept every pamphlet. Priority 1, locate the source of the Castellon type print. Priority 2, secure all rail yards, no civilian access. Priority 3, find Vance." Hayes was coordinating a massive three-pronged operation using the very infrastructure her syndicate controlled. The social impact on the scattered towns was instantaneous and volatile. The meticulously documented accusations in the Cinders ballad, with complete figures and dates that matched common knowledge of supply shortages during the war, hit the citizens hard. In Prosperity, Thorne's territory, panic gripped the town. Depositors lined up outside the Prosperity Exchange, not just to withdraw money, but to demand answers. Thorne's respectable facade crumbled overnight. The social currency of the good Christian banker was worthless. Men who had relied on Thorne's loans, including Kincaid's own foreman, were suddenly terrified, realizing their fortunes were tied to treasonous wealth. The core conflict was no longer abstract, it was personal, affecting their life savings. In the timber camps, Kincaid's territory, the exposure was even more destabilizing. The lumber workers, many of whom were veterans, reacted with furious betrayal. They saw Kincaid not just as a harsh boss, but as a traitor who had starved and murdered their comrades. Strikes erupted instantly. The social change of the era was the growing strength of organized labor, and the pamphlet provided the moral justification for an outright revolt. Kincaid's mill, a symbol of his brutal power, was suddenly under siege by his own employees. In Cheyenne, Hayes's territory, the reaction was colder, more insidious. Hayes controlled the elite social circles. The powerful men of the syndicate denied everything, issuing blistering counterstatements through the Cheyenne newspapers, calling the Cinder a socialist anarchist and Elias Vance a discredited, insane former clerk. Hayes used the full weight of her capital to impose a media blackout, but the truth, once whispered, could not be unsaid. The pamphlet created a deep, irreversible polarization between the laborers and the barons. Elias knew his window of safety was closing fast. He had to deliver the ledger and the files to a safe harbor, a federal authority that couldn't be bought off by Hayes. The nearest reliable federal marshal's office was in the state capital, accessible only by a single high-security passenger line. He needed to board a train, but Hayes had locked down the rail yards. He doubled back toward the main Union Pacific line, hiding near a massive maintenance yard outside a small town named Laramie. The yard was eerily silent, patrolled by armed guards, not the usual rail police, but private security employed by the syndicate. As Elias watched from the shadows, he saw a familiar, horrifying sight. A passenger carriage being pulled onto a siding. It was a private, opulent car, and standing on the platform, silhouetted against the yard lights, was the stern-faced chief enforcer he had seen in Cheyenne, Hayes's right-hand man. But it was what they were doing that made Elias's blood run cold. They weren't looking for him,
They were establishing a mobile command post. Beneath the gaze of the Iron Horse, Hayes's strategy was to use the speed and mobility of the rail system itself to hunt him. Hayes wasn't just tracking the paper, she was tracking the man. She knew the archives could not be fully exposed unless the original source, Elias, presented them to a legitimate authority. Desperate, he risked a final move. He approached a small independent printer in Laramie, one who hadn't yet been cowed by Hayes's threats. He handed the printer a sealed note and enough gold to ensure his compliance and silence. The note was a simple short telegram addressed to an influential, reform-minded congressman in Washington, a man known for his anti-monopoly stance. Final evidence of syndicate treason en route via 3 o'clock express, the Cinder. He had to trust the telegraph, the enemy's own tool, to deliver the message. He wasn't relying on the line's speed, but on the certainty that Hayes's agents would intercept it. The plan was a deadly gamble. He would use himself as bait. Elias knew the private car at the siding, the mobile command post, was positioned to intercept the next passenger express heading east. By sending a coded message that indicated he was on the 3 o'clock express, he guaranteed that Hayes's most lethal agents would be waiting on that particular train. He didn't wait for the express. He sneaked into the yard, choosing a different route. He bypassed the luxury express and instead boarded a massive unescorted freight engine, the Jupiter, that was scheduled to pull a load of machinery west, away from the capital, toward the high peaks. He climbed into the firebox car, caked in coal dust, hidden from the light. He knew Hayes's men would search the express line first, chasing the false scent of the anonymous telegram. As the Jupiter engine began to chuff and gain speed, moving him deeper into the desolate landscape, Elias watched the rail line recede. He was leaving the direct route to safety, heading toward the unforgiving mountains. He was fleeing the clutches of Hayes, but he was also heading toward a confrontation with his other enemy. The next stop for the Jupiter was a maintenance depot near the high mountain pass, the same pass that held the largest, most critical trestle bridge of the Union Pacific Line, a bridge that was essential to Kincaid's lumber operations. Elias clutched the ledger and the files. The Iron Horse had built their empires, and now, beneath its gaze, it was dictating the final confrontation. He had successfully delivered the truth, but the consequences of that delivery, the inevitable violent retribution from Kincaid and Hayes, were bearing down on him. His journey, initially a quiet pursuit of moral absolution, had become a desperate race against a ruthless, technologically empowered enemy, leading him to the final act of this historical drama. The Jupiter freight engine roared west, its massive boiler consuming coal and spitting smoke into the cold mountain air. Elias Vance huddled in the tender, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying realization of the enemy's efficiency. He had expected rage from Marcus Kincaid and panic from Silas Thorne. He had not anticipated the swift, coordinated, and silent retaliation orchestrated from Cheyenne. Josephine Hayes was not a visible villain like the others. She was the unseen hand that controlled the entire network. Elias had seen the messages flying across the telegraph lines and the deployment of the private security on the rail yards. He knew that Hayes was not merely rich. She was the master strategist of the entire operation, moving capital and men like pieces on a continental chessboard. Josephine Hayes was the true heir to the dark legacy of the merchant's ledger. She had no need for the public approval sought by Thorne, nor the rough dominion of Kincaid. Her power lay in her invisibility and her penetration of the system. Back in Cheyenne, in her meticulously organized private office, a space that felt more like a fortress than a workplace, Josephine Hayes stood before a massive map of the American West. The map was overlaid with a spider web of colored threads representing rail lines, telegraph cables, and land deeds held by her Wyoming Transportation Syndicate. She was impeccably dressed, her expression as sharp and unyielding as the granite of the mountains. She was the perfect embodiment of the era's overarching threat, the rise of the untouchable corporate power, a force that could corrupt government, control communication, and eliminate threats with bureaucratic impunity. "He is on the Jupiter, heading west toward the Red Rock Trestle," stated the chief enforcer, a grim man named Barrett. "We intercepted the manifest from Laramie. The telegram to the congressman was a diversion."
Hayes didn't look away from the map. "Vance is an archivist, Barrett. He always plans 2 steps ahead. He knew we'd intercept his message. His real target is not the Congress, not yet. His target is leverage." She tapped the map, her finger resting on the massive trestle bridge that spanned a dizzying canyon near Kincaid's territory. That trestle is essential to Kincaid's lumber operations. It is also the most critical infrastructure for the entire Union Pacific Western route. If Vance has the ledger, he won't use it to merely talk. He will use it to break something. Hayes was the first to fully grasp the nature of Elias's threat. He wasn't a blackmailer. He was a saboteur of foundations. The overarching threat was not simply the greed of 3 individuals. It was the realization that the corrupt capital from the war had created an almost unstoppable monopoly that controlled the West's vital infrastructure. Hayes addressed her 2 subordinate villains through the telegraph system, using a secure coded line that bypassed official company logs. Thorne was near collapse. The run on the Prosperity Exchange had been stemmed only by an emergency injection of funds from Hayes's syndicate. But the social standing he cherished was gone. "The pamphlets have ruined me, Josephine," Thorne's coded reply screamed across the wire. "The people know. Vance has broken my trust. I can't hold the bank." Hayes's reply was instantaneous and chilling. "You will hold the bank, Silas. You will remain the picture of calm legitimacy. If your bank fails, it exposes the syndicate's emergency loan and the entire structure falls. You are the mask, Silas. You will wear it until this is over. Your life and the life of your family depends on your performance." Thorne, the man who craved respectability, was trapped in the spotlight by the unseen hand. He was forced to smile, greet customers, and calm their fears, while knowing his entire empire was a house of cards ready to burn. His only purpose was to absorb the pressure, keeping the public distracted while Hayes worked in the shadows. Kincaid was operating on pure fury. The striking workers had shut down his mill, and armed men were guarding his timber stacks. His empire was paralyzed. "I have men hunting that fool Vance. I'll crush him myself. But I need the National Guard to break this strike, Josephine," Kincaid demanded. Hayes's instruction was surgical. "You will not crush the strike, Marcus. You will offer a major public concession, a higher wage, a new schoolhouse. Be the benevolent baron. Why? Because the moment you use federal troops, the media focuses on you, and we lose the narrative. Your power is chaos. Mine is control. Focus on finding Vance's original ledger. The paper pamphlets are trash. The book is the evidence. Find the book." Kincaid, the man of brute force, was forced into a humiliating act of public generosity, a strategy dictated entirely by the subtle, calculating mind of Hayes. He realized with grinding frustration that the strike, the collapse of his business, was merely a distraction being managed by Josephine. Elias, now deep in the mountains aboard the Jupiter, deduced this pattern. He realized Hayes wasn't focused on retrieving the files he stole. She was focused on protecting the structural integrity of the entire operation. Hayes's greatest fear was the ledger itself, the one document that connected the original treason to the modern syndicate structure. If the ledger became public, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a federal case of treason, potentially invoking long-dormant military law
that could seize all assets funded by the stolen property. Hayes knew the rules of the new Gilded Age. A corporation could survive fraud, labor abuse, and even public scorn, but it could not survive treason. This knowledge gave Elias his target, the Red Rock Trestle. The trestle was a breathtaking wooden monster spanning a 400-foot canyon, an engineering marvel and a monument to Kincaid's lumber. If that trestle was destroyed, Kincaid's timber shipments would stop instantly. More importantly, the entire westward rail movement would halt, paralyzing Hayes's logistics empire. As the Jupiter chuffed higher into the passes, Elias saw the massive, winding tracks of the approaching trestle. "We'll stop here for water and brake inspection, son," the Jupiter's engineer called to Elias, noticing the bruised passenger. Elias climbed down, moving swiftly. He had to reach the trestle before the Jupiter crossed it. He found the maintenance access to the canyon rim. He had only a few minutes. He didn't carry dynamite, but he had the archivist's tool, precision. He moved along the side of the track, looking for a critical point of failure in the aging wooden structure. Just as he reached the trestle's approach, he saw them, 3 of Hayes's men, including Barrett, the chief enforcer, arriving on small, fast handcars. Hayes had predicted his target. "Vance, stop right there. The lady wants the books," Barrett yelled, drawing a rifle. Elias sprinted onto the bridge. The wooden ties were slick with dew, the drop below terrifying. He was running toward the ultimate confrontation, with the unseen hands agents closing in behind him. He stopped in the center of the trestle, the abyss yawning on both sides. He reached into his coat and pulled out the merchant's ledger and the syndicate files. He held them up. "You tell Josephine Hayes that I am settling the debt. The only thing that can kill the empire is the foundation on which it was built." He tore a page from the syndicate files, a key document listing the original shell companies, and tossed it into the wind. Then, with a scream of adrenaline and desperation, Elias used his archivist skills one last time. He reached down to the track where a small, crucial spike, a key structural pin holding a tension cable, was secured. Using a heavy rock, he began furiously hammering the spike, weakening the central support of the trestle. Barrett fired. The shot missed, splintering wood near Elias's head. Elias didn't stop until the spike was half driven out, leaving the structure dangerously compromised. He looked at Barrett, then raised the ledger and the files over his head one last time. "You tell your employer that the only way to silence the truth is to destroy the evidence." And then, with the terrifying certainty that this was the only way to settle the secret debt and force the ultimate reckoning, Elias Vance flung the merchant's ledger and the syndicate files out over the canyon. The 2 books tumbled, spinning over the void, descending hundreds of feet before hitting the torrent below, swallowed instantly by the white water. Barrett froze, horrified. "No! You fool! You ruined everything!" "No, Barrett," Elias said, stepping away from the spike, his voice quiet but firm. "The cinder has the copies. The foundation is gone. You cannot prosecute me for holding books I no longer possess, and now you cannot stop the structural collapse." The Jupiter, unaware of the drama, began to slowly cross the far end of the trestle. The massive weight of the engine hit the compromised tension cable. A loud, sickening crack echoed across the canyon. The trestle groaned. Elias began running across the trestle, away from the collapsing section. Barrett and his men were caught on the side of the bridge, approaching the catastrophic failure. The unseen hand had tracked him perfectly, cornered him perfectly, and calculated his actions perfectly, except for one thing: Elias Vance's unwavering determination to destroy the original evidence, to guarantee the safety of the copies, and by extension, the truth. The Jupiter made it across just as the center section of the Red Rock Trestle buckled with a roar of tearing wood and metal,
plunging Kincaid's vital artery and Hayes's logistics into the abyss.
Elias made it to the other side, collapsing on the dirt just as the engine disappeared into the tunnel. He had shattered Hayes's control and forced a confrontation that would now be impossible to hide. The final reckoning was at hand, dictated by the collapse of a single, massive bridge. The destruction of the Red Rock Trestle was not a quiet act of sabotage. It was a thunderous declaration of war. The colossal wooden structure, which had symbolized the unwavering ambition of the Union Pacific and the fortunes of Marcus Kincaid and Josephine Hayes, lay scattered in the deep canyon, consumed by the torrent below. Elias Vance, having fled the site on foot, knew the act would change everything. The central artery of the Western economy was severed. Shipments of Kincaid's lumber were halted. Hayes's entire logistical system was paralyzed. The chaos he had sought to create was now a furious reality. He found temporary refuge in a dilapidated mining shack high on the ridge, looking down toward the town of Prosperity. He was exhausted, battered, and utterly alone, the burning certainty of his redemption the only thing keeping him moving. The immediate reaction was brutal. Hayes and Kincaid, their infrastructure shattered, abandoned their measured strategies and returned to the primal urge for retribution. Barrett, Hayes's chief enforcer, finding Elias vanished and the trestle destroyed, telegraphed the news back to Cheyenne. Hayes's response was brief and lethal. She activated every hired gun and private agent across the 3 territories with a single overriding order: find Vance, dead or alive. Focus on the only link he still possesses, Silas Thorne. Elias, relying on the fragments of information carried by passing riders and the distant plumes of smoke, began to piece together the chaos. The workers at Kincaid's mill, emboldened by the pamphlet's truths and the sudden paralysis of the company, had turned their strike into an open revolt, seizing control of the machinery. But the most immediate and personal crisis was unfolding in Prosperity. Silas Thorne was trapped. He was the most visible, least protected of the 3 conspirators, forced by Hayes to project an image of calm stability. When the news of the trestle's destruction arrived, the fragile confidence of Prosperity's citizens snapped. The panic run on Thorne's bank, which had been simmering, boiled over into a furious mob demanding the return of their savings. Thorne, desperate and cornered, armed his staff. The chaos in the street was matched by the chaos in the bank as the mob surged against the barred doors. Elias, receiving a frantic coded warning from a sympathetic rider, a member of Ada Sterling's network, knew he had to act. Thorne was a compromised man, but if he was killed, the final link to the truth, the detailed context of the original ledger that only he could provide, would be lost forever. Thorne was the witness Elias needed for the final trial. Elias arrived near Prosperity just as the sun set, cloaking the town in the ominous twilight of a brewing storm. The river that ran past the town, usually a placid ribbon of mountain runoff, was about to earn its namesake. The riot had reached its peak. The mob, desperate and fueled by liquor and the Cinders pamphlets, had managed to smash through the heavy doors of the Prosperity Exchange. Elias scaled a low roof and watched the horrifying scene unfold. The lobby, usually a place of quiet, dignified commerce, was a brutal melee of flying wood, tearing paper, and screaming voices. Thorne, standing behind the vault door, was firing a small pistol into the air in a desperate attempt to disperse the crowd, but the mob was relentless. They surged forward, driven by the desperation of men who saw their life savings, their homes, and their future dissolving into a lie. Then the final, fatal element arrived: Barrett and Hayes's enforcers. They didn't come to save Thorne, they came to silence him.
Barrett knew that with the physical ledger gone, Thorn was the last repository of the secret debt. His orders had shifted: eliminate the liability. The enforcers, disciplined and ruthless, didn't fire warning shots. They opened fire on the rioters, creating a shocking burst of violence that ripped through the crowd. Men fell screaming, and the desperate cry of the mob turned into a panicked rout. Thorn, seeing the enforcers, realized his fate. He wasn't being rescued, he was being executed. He fired his pistol at Barrett, missing wildly. Elias watched, horrified, as one of the enforcers calmly stepped forward and shot Thorn once, cleanly, in the chest. Thorn crumpled behind the counter, his expensive suit darkening instantly. The bank's white marble floor, the symbol of his false legitimacy, was stained crimson. The rioters, terrified by the calculated brutality of the enforcers, poured out of the bank. The bloodshed, the crisis, was complete. The violence spilled out onto Main Street, where the retreating rioters encountered Barrett and his men attempting to secure the perimeter. The river ran red that night, metaphorically, with the immediate, brutal collapse of social order. Elias, watching the scene, felt a wave of icy despair. His witness was gone. His path to redemption had just been made infinitely harder. The personal stakes had been raised to an unbearable height. His meticulous plan had led to the violent death of the man he needed to save. He had to get to Thorn, not for revenge, but for the remnants of truth that might still be in the bank. Using the confusion of the scattered rioters and the enforcers' focus on locking down the bank, Elias slipped down from the roof and dashed into the chaos. He dodged a fleeing rioter and ducked beneath the swinging doors of the exchange. The air inside smelled of smoke, blood, and gunpowder. Barrett and his remaining men were moving toward the vault, confirming Thorn was dead. Elias scrambled over the marble counter and reached Thorn. The banker was fading fast, his eyes clouded with fear and regret. "Silas," Elias whispered, grabbing his shoulder. "It's Elias. Did you keep anything? Anything that survived the ledger?" Thorn coughed, his breath rattling. Blood welled up on his lips. He weakly pointed a trembling finger to the heavy safe door behind him, which he had been guarding. The original draft, the agreement," Thorn gasped, his voice barely audible above the ringing in Elias's ears. "Hayes made us sign before we started. The names, all of us, the signatures, under penalty of military law." He managed one last rattling breath. Tell Caleb, I tried." Thorn went slack. The last living witness to the inner workings of the secret debt was dead. Elias had seconds. He fumbled with the combination Thorn had given him months ago during their clandestine conversation in Cheyenne, a combination to a small private compartment within the bank's main vault. He heard Barrett's boots approaching. "He's still alive! Get him!" Elias managed to turn the tumbler on the compartment. It clicked open. Inside, tucked away not among money, but amongst old bound legal texts, was a thick roll of parchment, a formal, sealed document, the Articles of Partnership for the original war profiteering scheme. It was the single most critical piece of evidence, a formal, legal document signed by Silas Thorn, Marcus Kincaid, and Josephine Hayes, explicitly stating their intent and their equal shares in the profits of the Special Assets Reallocation Fund, the stolen supplies. The inclusion of a clause referencing military law made it a time bomb, a document that could invoke federal prosecution. He snatched the parchment and turned to face Barrett, who was standing over the counter, leveling his pistol.
"It ends now, Vance. The lady told me if the ledger was destroyed, I only needed to bring you back in pieces," Barrett sneered. Elias had no weapon, no defense, and a deep-seated revulsion toward violence. But he had the Articles of Partnership. If you shoot me, you'll be killing a dead man's final witness, and you'll be sealing your own fate, Elias said, holding up the parchment. This document is not code. It is a formal, signed agreement. Hayes's signature is on it. If I die here, this paper goes to the federal marshal, and you, Barrett, are an accessory to treason. Barrett hesitated, his cold eyes flicking from Elias's desperate face to the parchment. He was an enforcer, not a revolutionary. He understood contracts and consequences. "Drop the paper, Vance," Barrett ordered, his hand trembling slightly. Elias knew this was his only chance. He feigned throwing the paper toward the enforcer, and as Barrett flinched, Elias hurled himself sideways, smashing through a large window. He hit the alleyway below in a spray of shattered glass, landing hard on the muddy earth. The fresh blood from his wounds mixed instantly with the thick, bloody mud of the alley. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the parchment, and ran toward the river. The night the river ran red had claimed Thorne, but it had yielded the ultimate proof. As he reached the dark, churning waters of the river, the frantic shouts of Barrett and his men echoing behind him, Elias realized his pursuit was no longer about exposure. It was about survival. He was holding the key to the entire conspiracy, and Josephine Hayes would use every resource of the Iron Horse and her unseen hand to silence him and recover the document. The crisis had raised the personal stakes. Elias was now hunted not just for his knowledge, but for the final physical proof of the treason that founded the American West. Elias Vance emerged from the dark, churning waters of the river, bruised, soaked, and clutching the rolled parchment, the Articles of Partnership, to his chest. The chaos of prosperity was fading behind him, replaced by the immediate, primal need for survival. Hayes's enforcers, led by Barrett, would assume he was still heading toward civilization, toward the nearest rail line or telegraph office. He did the opposite. He plunged deeper into the wilderness, moving toward the vast, empty plains bordering the territory. He was committed to one goal: delivering the articles to the one place Hayes could not reach, federal jurisdiction, far from the syndicate's immediate grasp. His path of retreat was dictated by a single desperate memory: a small, isolated garrison known as Fort Keogh, located far to the north near the tribal lands. Fort Keogh was the last vestige of the true federal military presence, a place where the authority of the U.S. Army still outweighed the corrupting influence of capital. Elias's commitment was now absolute, an oath taken in the blood-stained mud of prosperity. The death of Silas Thorne had shattered his plan for a controlled public exposé, but it had refined his purpose. The original moral debt of the merchant's ledger was no longer merely a document. It was a physical artifact of corruption that had cost the lives of two men he knew: Silas Thorne, however corrupt, and the innocent Caleb Thorne. He was no longer seeking personal redemption. He was seeking justice for the dead and survival for the truth. As he traveled north through the high, windswept plains, navigating by the stars, the same foreign star that guided countless immigrants and fugitives across the continent, Elias reflected on the nature of his true commitment. He had abandoned his archivist's neutrality. He was now a participant, a man willing to sacrifice comfort, safety, and even the appearance of lawfulness, as seen in the trestle destruction, to fight the tyranny of the unseen hand. He was committed to reaching the fort and placing the Articles of Partnership, signed and sealed by the conspirators, into the hands of a superior authority that could invoke the military treason clause within the document. After 3 days of grueling travel,
subsisting on meager supplies and the kindness of isolated farmers who saw the desperation in his eyes, Elias reached the remote perimeter of Fort Keogh. The fort was a somber collection of wooden barracks and earthwork defenses, situated on land still contested by the native tribes. It felt like a small island of civilization, floating in a sea of raw, unforgiving land. The fort's atmosphere was a stark contrast to the boom towns. Here, the law was rigid, based on rank and duty, not money. The foreign star of military authority was the only power that Hayes's money could not instantly buy. Elias approached the main gate, his clothes torn and covered in dried mud, his face scarred and bruised. He was immediately seized by the guards and taken to the commanding officer. Captain Alistair Finch was a man in his late 40s, prematurely gray with the weary dignity of someone who had seen too many conflicts, both military and political. He was an officer of the old school, whose commitment was to the flag and the oath of service, a type increasingly rare in the politically charged West. "You claim to have information that is a matter of treason, Mr. Vance, and you claim to have been chased here by the agents of the Wyoming Transportation Syndicate," Captain Finch asked, leaning back in his chair, his expression skeptical but attentive. "I do, Captain," Elias confirmed, his voice rough. "And I have the original signed proof of their conspiracy." He unrolled the damp, wrinkled parchment. Finch took it, his fingers carefully smoothing the surface. As he read the title, Articles of Partnership, Special Assets Reallocation Fund, and then saw the signatures of Thorne, Kincaid, and Hayes, followed by the chilling reference to the Military Jurisdiction Act of 1862, the captain's skepticism evaporated. "The Military Jurisdiction Act," Finch whispered, his eyes widening. "This clause means that any property acquired by this fund, being the result of wartime treason, is subject to immediate seizure and court-martial jurisdiction, regardless of civil law." The document was more powerful than Elias had dared to hope. Hayes's desire for an airtight contract, binding all partners equally, had provided the ultimate self-destruct mechanism. Finch immediately recognized the terrifying scope of the threat. This wasn't just local corruption. This was a conspiracy that had built a substantial part of the West's economic infrastructure on treason. Exposing it would cause a financial and political earthquake. "Mr. Vance, this is extraordinary. If this is authentic, the entire syndicate is forfeit. Their rail lines, their land, their banks, all revert to federal military control." Elias nodded. "That is the only way to truly stop them, Captain. The civil courts are too slow, and Hayes has bought too many judges." However, the captain saw the immediate, practical difficulty. "The moment I telegraph this document to Washington, the military channels will be compromised. Hayes has money and influence everywhere, and Fort Keogh is isolated. If they know the document is here, they will send an army, not just a handful of enforcers." Captain Finch needed a plan to get the document safely to the War Department in Washington, D.C., and he needed someone to testify to its context and legitimacy. "You, Mr. Vance, are the key witness, and you cannot leave this fort by any conventional means. They will be watching the railroads, the stage lines, the rivers. I know the risk, Captain. I have done my part. Now I need the military to uphold its oath and protect this document." Finch looked at the parchment, then at Elias, a solitary figure who had risked everything for an abstract ideal of accountability. He made a difficult decision, committing the limited resources of his remote command to a political war. "I can't trust the telegraph. I can't trust the rail. There is only one way to ensure this document reaches Washington undetected and protected. Finch said, standing up and walking toward a map showing the uncharted high plains and the Native American reservations. The document will travel with a specialized scouting party heading east through the wilderness, disguised as a topographical survey team. And you will go with them, Mr. Vance.
The scouting party was small, consisting of 4 experienced, hardened cavalry scouts, tasked with charting potential military roads. And their guide was the final and most unexpected ally in Elias's desperate journey. Chaitin, a Lakota scout who had been contracted by the army for his unparalleled knowledge of the desolate terrain. Chaitin was a man of quiet authority, his gaze penetrating and assessing. He was an alliance of pure necessity, an oath taken under a foreign star, the Lakota's ancient deep knowledge of the land, protecting the ultimate symbol of the white man's corrupt civilization. Elias was introduced to the scout. Chaitin, this man is not a soldier. He is a witness. He carries a document that can stop the men who are illegally seizing land and resources, including the land of your people. You must guide him and the document safely to the rendezvous point with the Eastern supply train. Chaitin studied Elias, the city man with blood on his color and fear in his eyes. The white man's wars always follow, Chaitin said in halting English, his voice deep. The iron horse, the fences, the paper with the names, they bring the sickness of greed to the clean land. This paper can stop the greed, Chaitin, Elias pleaded, holding out the roll of parchment. The men who signed this stole the supplies that fed the soldiers and starved the reservations. They are traitors to everyone. Chaitin finally nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The enemy of the land is the enemy of my people. I will guide you, archivist of the paper, but we travel by the moon and the wind, not by the rail and the wire. Your trust will be in the stars, not in your clock. Elias Vance, the former clerk who relied on timetables and ledgers, committed his fate to the raw, untamed wisdom of the prairie. He was dressed in rough buckskins, given a horse, and handed a rifle, which he accepted with grim reluctance. He was no soldier, but he was willing to act as one to fulfill his oath. As they rode out of Fort Keogh under the chill, alien light of the prairie moon, Elias knew he was moving toward the ultimate confrontation. Hayes's agents would soon realize the document was not destroyed, but was heading east. They would track him, not by rail, but by the same desperate path he was taking. The ultimate price of the secret debt would be paid not in a city square, but in the unforgiving wilderness, beneath the indifferent gaze of the foreign star. Elias Vance was deep in the high plains, riding with the military survey team. The articles of partnership, sealed in a waterproof dispatch tube, were strapped securely to his back beneath his coat. The silent, relentless guidance of the Lakota scout, Chaitin, was the only thing keeping them on course and ahead of the inevitable pursuit. For 3 days, the wilderness provided an illusion of safety. They avoided roads, sticking to ancient tribal trails known only to Chaitin, moving under the constant gaze of the prairie sun and the distant, foreign star. Elias felt a fragile hope bloom. The truth was moving, inexorably, toward justice. That hope was brutally extinguished on the 4th morning. The betrayal was revealed not by a gunshot or an ambush, but by the cold, precise workings of a clockwork mechanism, the perfect symbol of Josephine Hayes's calculated control. They had stopped to water their horses at a remote spring near an isolated pre-Civil War military post that had been abandoned for decades. While the others rested, Chaitin was scouting the eastern ridge. Elias was alone, checking the saddle of his horse when he heard a faint, rhythmic ticking. It was an unnatural sound in the vast silence of the prairie.
He traced the sound to a small, worn leather pouch tied securely beneath the saddle of Sergeant Major O'Connell, the ranking officer of the 3 cavalry scouts. O'Connell was a professional soldier, stoic, reliable, and seemingly dedicated to the mission given by Captain Finch. With a sudden, sickening lurch of dread, Elias realized what the ticking meant. He quickly cut the pouch open. Inside, nestled among a few scraps of dry pemmican, was a small, finely crafted pocket watch. It was a specialized piece, not a standard issue timepiece, but an elegant engraved silver watch attached to a length of thin wire. Elias, with his archivist's eye for detail, recognized the watch instantly. He had seen one just like it in the office of Josephine Hayes. It wasn't merely a watch. It was a sophisticated signaling device, a silent, coded beacon designed to emit a rhythmic vibration or sound that could be detected by a counterpart device within a short radius, often used for covert military coordination. O'Connell wasn't protecting the document. He was leading its trackers straight to it. The revelation of a close character's double-dealing landed with the force of a physical blow. O'Connell, the trusted military escort, was a paid agent of the syndicate. Hayes had purchased her way even into the inner circle of Fort Keogh, installing a clockwork mechanism of betrayal to ensure the document never left the wilderness. The scout returned, his face grim. "Riders, coming fast from the south. Too many for bandits. They are tracking us." Elias quickly tied the signaling watch back into the pouch, his mind racing. "They are not tracking us, Chaitin," he whispered, nodding toward the sergeant major, who was casually checking his rifle. "O'Connell?" Chaitin looked confused. "He has a silent signal, a timed device. He was only supposed to keep us on the route until the rendezvous, and then deliver the document to Hayes's men, not to Washington. Hayes didn't trust the military, but she trusted her own assets within it." The clockwork was ticking down to the confrontation. Elias walked slowly toward O'Connell. "Sergeant Major, those riders Chaitin spotted, they are coming from a direction that suggests they know our precise location. How could they know if they were not told?" O'Connell stopped cleaning his rifle. His eyes, usually honest and direct, now held a cold, ruthless glint, the same look Elias had seen in the office of Josephine Hayes. "That's highly irregular speculation, Vance," O'Connell said, his voice flat. He leveled the rifle at Elias. "But I think you've become unstable. I'll take that dispatch tube now for evidence." The other 2 scouts, honest soldiers, were confused, pointing their rifles at the central conflict. "Don't move, Sergeant Major," one of the scouts commanded. "He murdered a banker and blew up a trestle. He's a traitor," O'Connell roared, trying to use the pamphlet's chaos to justify his action. "The captain ordered me to seize the document if the witness became unstable." Elias, though weaponless, remained calm. He pointed at O'Connell's saddle. "The syndicate has a better hold on you than the flag, Sergeant Major. Check his saddle pouch. He carries a tracking beacon, a silver watch." Before O'Connell could react, Chaitin, who had been listening with the deep intensity of a hunter, moved with terrifying speed. He didn't use a weapon. He threw a handful of sand into O'Connell's face, momentarily blinding him. O'Connell fired wildly. The bullet struck one of the honest soldiers in the shoulder. The betrayal had escalated into a deadly firefight. The other 2 scouts, realizing the sergeant major had shot his own man and was clearly compromised, turned their rifles on O'Connell. The sergeant major, a trained killer, fired twice more, dropping the second scout. He grabbed the dispatch tube from Elias's back, tearing the coat fabric. "Hayes paid me handsomely for this," O'Connell screamed, clutching the tube.
Elias, fueled by pure, desperate fury, lunged at the betrayer, tackling him to the ground. They tumbled in a brutal struggle, the dry grass tearing at their skin. The dispatch tube, containing the priceless articles of partnership, rolled several feet away. O'Connell, stronger and better trained, quickly gained the upper hand, delivering a blow to Elias's head that left him dizzy and weak. The sergeant major crawled toward the fallen dispatch tube. Just as O'Connell reached the tube, a rifle shot rang out, not from the conflict, but from the ridge. It was Chayton, the scout, who had retrieved the sergeant major's discarded rifle. Chayton had shot O'Connell in the leg, crippling his immediate escape. Barrett and Hayes's enforcers, drawn by the sound of the initial shots, crested the ridge, rifles drawn. They saw the chaos, O'Connell wounded, 2 Federal scouts down, and Elias crawling toward the document. "O'Connell, you failed!" Barrett yelled, firing a warning shot. The sergeant major, his betrayal exposed and his escape cut off, made a final desperate move. He lunged back at Elias, not to kill him, but to destroy the evidence. He snatched a small burning coal from the fire pit where they had made their coffee and thrust it toward the parchment tube. Elias fought him off, twisting the tube away from the fire. Chayton, realizing the enforcers were about to open fire on the entire group, screamed in Lakota, then fired his rifle in a quick succession of shots. He wasn't aiming at the men, he was aiming at the horses of the enforcers, creating a screen of chaos and panicked animals. Elias seized the moment, grabbing the dispatch tube and scrambling back to his horse. Chayton was already mounted. "We go now, archivist. The white man's betrayal has ended the peace." They rode off at a desperate gallop, leaving behind the bodies of the fallen scouts, the wounded sergeant major, and the triumphant, furious enforcers. The pursuit was now focused and intense. The sergeant major's double dealing, the significant setback, had been more than a physical ambush. It had revealed the depth of Josephine Hayes's corruption. The military, the very institution Elias trusted to safeguard the truth, was compromised from within. Elias, riding through the dust, the dispatch tube pressed against his side, felt the chilling weight of the betrayal. He couldn't trust the military post, the telegraph, or the government officials. The clockwork mechanism of betrayal had taught him the ultimate lesson. The truth could only be protected by those who valued it above the system. He pulled up next to Chayton, staring at the vast, empty sky. "They will catch us, Chayton. They have more men. They will not stop," Elias gasped. Chayton didn't look at him. "They follow the money, archivist. We follow the wind. Where do we go now?" Elias looked at the scorched parchment tube, the symbol of his shattered faith in institutions. "You don't take the document to Washington, Chayton. We take it back to the only person who can weaponize it without fear of betrayal. We take it to the cinder. We take it to Ada Sterling." His new commitment was clear. The oath taken under a foreign star was now an oath to a revolutionary cause. He would abandon the slow, compromised channels of the law and commit fully to the power of the published truth. He was riding back into the belly of the beast, towards the printing press of the anonymous voice. The final fatal exposure would be delivered not by a judge, but by a newspaper. The betrayal of Sergeant Major O'Connell was not merely a loss of trust, it was the removal of the final buffer between Elias Vance and the syndicate's immense retaliatory power. Now there was no pretense of legality, no feigned protection under the flag. The chase was pure, savage pursuit. Elias and Chayton rode for a day and a night, cutting northeast toward the city. The landscape was a punishing canvas of scrub brush and blinding alkali dust. The Lakota scout, familiar with every fold and shadow of the land, chose a route that was suicidal for men, but invisible to trackers. The sheer cliff faces, the shadowed canyons, and the dry riverbeds that offered no easy path but endless cover. Elias clung to his saddle, his muscles screaming from the relentless pace. His consciousness focused solely on the waterproof tube strapped to his chest, the articles of partnership, the truth he carried, a desperate, fragile counterweight to the empire of lies hunting them. Chayton finally halted at dawn on the second day, overlooking a small, forgotten settlement.
barely more than a water tower and a feed store. He pointed back across the shimmering, heat-hazed plains. 3 groups. Chayton's voice was raspy from the dust. They are not soldiers. They are too fast, too efficient. They know the land like a fever knows a man. Barrett's men, Elias confirmed, pulling out his field glasses. He doesn't waste time with disguises anymore. They have realized I'm not heading back to Washington. They know the document is coming back to the Cinder. The whole horror of the situation settled over him. His change of direction, his new commitment to Ada Sterling's direct revolutionary path, had not fooled them. Josephine Hayes was too intelligent, too far-reaching in her network. She understood that a truth that couldn't be buried must be publicly destroyed. While Elias and Chayton fought the elements in the pursuit, the forces of the syndicate were consolidating in the city. The revelation that the articles were genuine, coupled with the fiasco of the Fort Coe ambush, had sent shockwaves through the corporate boardrooms of the Hayes Consortium. In her opulent, clockwork-adorned office, Josephine Hayes stood before a large map of the city, not in her usual polished composure, but with a cold, terrifying intensity. Opposite her sat Lionel Gantry, the true shadowy head of the syndicate's financial operations, and Marcus Kalin, the mayor, her bought asset and the public face of her control. Hayes, Gantry's voice was a low, guttural rasp, filled with menace. You assured us this man was neutralized. Instead, he has procured the document and turned back toward the city. This is incompetence that will cost us more than our fortunes. It will cost us our freedom. Hayes did not flinch. Vance underestimated me by going to the military. Now he has overestimated the Cinder's ability to protect him. He is returning to his source of rebellion. The Cinder's printing press is not secure. Ada Sterling's staff is a handful of fanatics. We stop the document and we crush the rebellion in a single blow. She turned to a new figure who stood apart, a man known only as the Engineer, an uncurvingly calm man in immaculate overalls, the head of the Hayes Consortium's private security and intelligence division. The document is the final objective, Engineer. Barrett's hunters will drive them into the city limits. Kalin will ensure the local police force is deployed to quarantine the area around the Old Market Square, where the Cinder's office is located, citing a sanitary threat. No one in, no one out. You will seal the block, acquire the document, and neutralize the remaining threats. Marcus Kalin, the mayor, wiped sweat from his brow. A sanitary quarantine, Josephine? The entire square? It's the most crowded part of the city. The citizens will revolt. They will be grateful for the protection from the supposed epidemic, Hayes said, her smile utterly devoid of warmth. The public fears disease more than corruption. Deploy the forces now, Mayor. The city square is about to become a theater of necessary sanitation. The forces aligned for the final grand confrontation. 1. The hunters, Barrett's mercenaries, driving Elias and Chayton into the trap. 2. The City Watch, Kalin's police force, establishing the perimeter, ensuring no escape and no public interference. 3. The Cleaners, the Engineers' Security and Intelligence Division, the elite corporate troops, tasked with entering the Cinder office, securing the articles, and permanently silencing all witnesses. The gathering storm was not of weather, but of organized malice, descending upon the city's heart.
Elias and Chayton reached the city limits just as the quarantine was announced, the ringing of bells and the blare of police sirens echoing through the narrow streets. The false panic was brilliantly effective. Citizens fled, terrified of the mysterious sudden plague, emptying the major thoroughfares and creating a clear path for the syndicate's final move.
They didn't just meet us outside the city, Elias yelled over the clamor, pulling his hat low. They planned the whole final act in the city square. The quarantine is for us, Chayton. The syndicate's tactics were textbook. Funnel the prey into a controlled area. The labyrinthine alleyways, usually their salvation, were now guarded by police cordons. Chayton, however, was already adjusting his plan. The police do not look for a fever that moves like the wind. We go to the high places, Archivist, the rooftops. They abandoned their exhausted horses near the stockyards and climbed the nearest fire escape. From the roofs, they moved like phantoms, vaulting air conditioning units and leaping across narrow gaps, the rhythmic hammering of the quarantine bells serving as a deadly soundtrack. Barrett's men, arriving moments later, paused at the sight of the abandoned horses. Barrett, a seasoned tracker, looked up. Fools. They think the roof is safer. Get up there. I want them taken alive. Hayes wants the document and the man who carried it. The hunters swarmed the rooftops, transforming the cityscape into a dangerous vertical gauntlet. The Cinder's office was situated on the third floor of an old brick building overlooking the city square, its windows facing the central fountain. The press itself, a massive ancient machine, dominated the ground floor. Inside, Ada Sterling and her small, fiercely loyal staff, 3 printers and 2 young copywriters, worked with a desperate, feverish focus. They had spent the last 2 days assembling the articles of partnership into a publishable, devastating special edition, working from Elias's initial coded messages and the outline of the corruption. A frantic knocking echoed at the front door. It was Dr. Penelope Reed, the old physician who had initially smuggled Elias out of the hospital. "Ada, you must leave." Penelope's face was pale. "They've sealed the square. It's not a plague, it's a blockade. The police are letting private security in, armed, dangerous men. They are coming for the press and for you." Ada's eyes narrowed, but her hand never left the stack of proofs. "We have the truth, Doctor. They have the guns. The press waits for no one. We print or we die in vain." She looked at her young copywriters. The final, boldest headline: "It must be clear. It must be a weapon." The copywriters, terrified but dedicated, pulled the proofs together. The sound of the pursuit was growing closer. Elias and Chayton, descending into the alleyway behind the Cinder building, found the back door locked and guarded by 2 uniformed officers. "Police! We have a fever case inside the building! Open up!" Elias yelled, desperate to create a diversion. The officers turned, surprised. Before they could react, Chayton, using a piece of salvaged pipe, moved like lightning. The sound was a dull thud, thud, and the 2 officers crumpled silently. "Go, Archivist. I will keep the back clear. The roof has become a battlefield. You have a few minutes only." Elias burst into the printing room. The smell of ink and oil, usually comforting, was now thick with the scent of fear. Ada looked up, her expression a mix of profound relief and dread. "Ada, you madman, you made it!" She rushed to him. "The press is ready. The lead types are set. We only needed the finalized, authenticated document." He pulled the dispatch tube from his chest, the final unburned proof of the conspiracy. "Hayes has the entire city sealed. The engineer is coming up the front stairs now with armed men. We have minutes, not hours, minutes." Ada didn't hesitate. She grabbed the tube. "I need 1 minute to compare the seals. If they match, we run the press." Elias turned to face the door. "Go, Ada. I'll buy you that minute." He checked the discarded rifles of the unconscious officers. One was empty, the other had 3 rounds, not nearly enough. The sounds of the city were replaced by the shattering of glass and the heavy boots of the engineer's men moving up the stairs. The door handle rattled violently. Elias braced himself, lifting the rifle. "Ready, Elias?" Ada called, her trembling voice. "Ready for what's coming, Ada." "Not ready to fight, ready to publish," she screamed. Ada did not compare the seals. She had seen the authentic articles of partnership once before, in a moment of stolen courage. She trusted Elias's journey more than a forensic examination. She slapped the document onto the printing bed. With a deep metallic groan that shook the old building, the ancient machine roared into life. The heavy press cranked down, printing the first page of the exposé. The front door splintered. The engineer stepped into the room, flanked by 4 security men in dark tactical uniforms. He surveyed the scene, Elias holding a useless rifle, Ada beside the massive rumbling press. The engineer's expression was of clinical disappointment. "Mr. Vance," the engineer's voice was calm, almost bored. "Give me the document. The operation is compromised, but the final objective is simple. Hand it over, and we can end this without further mess." "The mess has already been made, engineer." Elias fired his 3 rounds. One hit the press's enormous flywheel, sending a shower of sparks that momentarily blinded the syndicate's men. The other 2 struck the wall near the engineer, forcing the men to take cover. Ada, tears streaming down her face from the smoke and the sheer terror, was feeding the massive sheets of paper into the machine. The first copies, the final damning proof, were being pressed. The engineer stood up, wiping dust from his uniform. "Destroy the press. Take the man." The fight was brutal and unequal. Elias, fueled by the last embers of his exhaustion and the righteousness of his cause, charged the men. He used the piles of paper, the barrels of ink, and the very machinery as weapons and cover. Meanwhile, on the roof, the battle between Barrett's hunters and Chayton had reached a deadly climax. Chayton, armed with only a hunting knife and his intimate knowledge of the structure, had picked off 2 of Barrett's men. But Barrett himself, a man of cold, efficient malice, had finally cornered the scout. "You're protecting a dead cause, savage," Barrett sneered, his pistol aimed steadily. "The truth is never dead," Chayton responded, disappearing into the shadows of a ventilation unit. Below, Elias was overwhelmed. A steel-toed boot slammed into his ribs, and the rifle was kicked away. He looked up at the engineer, who stood over him, holding a pneumatic bolt gun, a clean, quiet instrument of death. "A shame, Vance," the engineer said, raising the weapon. "You could have done great things for the consortium." At that exact moment, the rhythmic roar of the press downstairs reached a crescendo. The final immense copies of the special edition rolled off the rollers.
The articles of treason was printed. The engineer hesitated, his focus momentarily shattered by the sound of publication. He looked down at Elias with dawning horror. The moment of absolute truth had arrived. "You're too late," Elias rasped, spitting blood. Before the engineer could pull the trigger, the windows facing the square shattered. Barrett's men, having secured the roof, were now rappelling down the exterior. But they weren't alone. A third sound, louder than the press and the gunshots, rose from the city square below. The people. The police quarantine, which Hayes had relied on to seal the square, had been breached. Ada's 2 copywriters, having escaped moments before the final breach of the front door, had run to the nearest balconies, throwing the first printed copies of the articles of treason, the full, unredacted truth, into the square below. The sheets fluttered down like snow, landing in the hands of the few remaining citizens and the curious crowds that had gathered at the perimeter. A low, collective gasp rippled through the square, followed by a confused, then rapidly growing roar. The people were reading the truth: the theft of the planes, the corporate corruption of the government, the murder of innocents, all laid bare by the syndicate's own hands. The sanitary quarantine was exposed as a lie. The people, their fear of the fabricated disease, replaced by rage against the genuine conspiracy, surged forward. They overwhelmed the police barricades, their anger a tidal wave. The engineer looked out the broken window at the square, watching his tactical advantage collapse into democratic chaos. The people were no longer sheep, they were a force. Barrett, rappelling through the window, saw his target. He ignored the engineer and aimed for the press itself. "Destroy the machine! Burn the proofs!"
Chayton, wounded but alive, dropped from the ceiling rafters, intercepting Barrett with a desperate tackle. The two men crashed into a pile of ink-stained paper. Ada Sterling, the Cinder, unattended in the chaos, was gazing toward the front door. She had done her part. Now she was trying to secure a final escape route for her staff, as even the glass in the front windows began to buckle under the pressure of the mob. Elias, reaching the rear door, found his path blocked by the two security men who had been with the engineer. They were firing wildly into the ceiling, trying to suppress the public while keeping Elias cornered. He feigned a move toward the window, causing one man to turn. He used the split second to hurl a heavy block of lead type, the essential building blocks of the press, with all his remaining strength. It struck the second security man in the head with a sickening thud, dropping him instantly. Elias charged the remaining man, using the shock of his comrade's fall to throw the man off balance and wrestle the pistol from his grip. He now held a weapon, a heavy, brutal instrument of Hayes's power. Elias had refused to carry a gun throughout his entire journey, rooted in his conviction that his weapon was truth, not lead. Now, faced with a man who would kill him without hesitation, he had a choice: fire or fall. He raised the pistol, aiming center mass. The moment of peak tension arrived, a silent, moral crucible in the middle of the deafening storm. The man, terrified, dropped his rifle and threw his hands up. Elias squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell on a cold, empty chamber. The gun, either having misfired or having exhausted its small clip in the initial exchange, had betrayed him. The security man, seeing Elias's shock and hearing the useless click, lunged forward with renewed, desperate violence. But the moment, the silent space between the click and the lunge, was enough. The test of the empty chamber was not a test of Elias's marksmanship. It was a test of his morality. Even with death seconds away, and with the means in his hand, Elias had chosen the path of lethal force, only to have fate intervene. The weapon's failure forced him to revert to his true nature. He swung the heavy, empty pistol like a hammer, striking the man on the temple, knocking him unconscious. He did not kill him. He was still the archivist, the man who dealt in documentation, not destruction. The empty chamber affirmed his path. Elias burst through the rear door and out into the narrow, refuse-choked alley, pursued immediately by the engineer, who had seen his escape. The engineer still held the silent, specialized bolt gun. He was precise, focused, and utterly without passion, the perfect agent of corporate control. The article is worthless if the public doesn't believe the man who printed it, Vance. You've committed treason. I'm simply enforcing property rights. Elias stopped, turning to face his final corporate enemy. Property rights built on stolen goods are treason, engineer. The chamber may be empty, but the press has spoken. He hurled the empty pistol at the engineer's head. It struck him on the shoulder, throwing off his aim just as he fired the bolt gun. The bolt sliced past Elias's ear, embedding itself in the brick wall with a sickening thwack. Elias ran toward a precarious wooden staircase leading to a higher roof, dragging the heavy bundle of papers.
The pursuit was short. The engineer was faster, trained to navigate the urban environment. He reached the bottom of the staircase and fired again. This time, the bolt struck Elias squarely in the leg. Elias stumbled, crying out in pain, the shock and pain sending him crashing against the wooden structure. He fell, tumbling down the final 3 steps, the bundle of printed articles scattering across the muddy ground. The engineer climbed the stairs, the bolt gun leveled for the final clean kill. Elias, bleeding heavily, desperately crawled toward the scattered pages. At that moment, the confrontation in the printing room reached its terrifying climax. Barrett, having overpowered Chayton, had seized a large can of highly flammable printing oil. He was dousing the press, preparing to set the entire office and Ada ablaze. Chayton,
bleeding and defeated, watched from the floor. But the furious roar of the mob was closer now. They had breached the perimeter and were forcing their way through the front door of the Cinder office. The clash of the three forces, the enraged citizens, the trapped enforcers, and the desperate victims, was a spectacular collision. Barrett, seeing the tide turn, abandoned the fire. He grabbed Ada, using her as a shield to fight his way to the back exit, desperate to escape the inevitable justice of the crowd. He burst out into the alleyway, dragging Ada and colliding instantly with the engineer. "Barrett, what in God's name happened?" the engineer demanded, lowering his gun, distracted by the sudden massive complication of a hostage. "The mob! The press ran! We are surrounded! This one comes with me!" Barrett shrieked, pulling Ada tighter against him. Elias, seizing the moment of confusion, lunged, grabbing Barrett's leg. The sudden desperate tackle sent all three tumbling to the ground. Ada screamed. In the ensuing tangle, the dispatch tube containing the few remaining original proofs of the Articles of Partnership, the tube Elias had been carrying for weeks, was wrenched loose and rolled under a tipped-over trash barrel. The engineer, realizing the severity of the situation, aimed his bolt gun not at Elias, but at Barrett. "You fail, you are the liability," the engineer stated, upholding the cold corporate philosophy of the syndicate. He pulled the trigger. The bolt found its mark. Barrett gasped, his eyes wide in surprise, and he went limp, falling heavily on the ground, releasing Ada. The engineer, having eliminated the incompetent enforcer, turned the bolt gun toward Elias and Ada. "The asset must be recovered, and the witnesses must be contained," he said, his voice returning to his calm, clinical tone. But before he could fire, the entire rear wall of the alleyway burst inward. The citizens, led by the fiercest of the miners and laborers who had read the pamphlets, had used a heavy timber beam to smash through the building, seeking vengeance. They poured into the alleyway, a flood of furious, righteous humanity. They saw the scene, the defeated men, the scattered papers, and the unconscious security guards, and the cold figure of the engineer with his strange, lethal weapon. The engineer, facing 100 men armed with shovels, rocks, and the terrible power of collective fury, made the only rational choice: retreat. He dropped the bolt gun, climbed over the collapsed brickwork, and fled into the back streets, disappearing into the wider, more chaotic city, leaving his fallen comrades and the scene of the crime behind him. The climax was over. The violence had crested and receded, leaving behind a profound stillness. Ada, shaking but unharmed, rushed to Elias. She knelt beside him, checking the bolt wound in his leg. "Elias, you're alive! You won! The people, they have the truth!" Elias, looking past her, pointed weakly to the scattered pages and then to the trash barrel. The citizens were already retrieving the papers, holding them up, reading the proof with horrified confirmation. "The truth is safe," Elias whispered, clutching the discarded, empty pistol. The test was passed. The moral conflict had resolved not through Elias's ability to kill, but through his relentless commitment to disclosure. The empty chamber had forced him to rely on the power of the press, and the people had become the ultimate executioner of the syndicate's plot. The river had run red, the storm had gathered, and the test had been passed. Now the quiet work of justice and the recovery of the surviving syndicate members could begin. The chaos in the city square subsided not with a final shot, but with the collective, stunned realization that the war was over. The collapse of the syndicate's military arm in the alleyway, the defeat of Barrett, and the tactical retreat of the engineer was the public signal that the unseen hand had been severed. The true climax had arrived not in the physical defeat of a man, but in the total, irreversible public exposure of a system. Elias Vance lay on the broken pavement, the pain from the bolt wound in his leg a searing focus, but the greater weight of his moral debt finally lifted. He had fulfilled his oath. The truth in the form of thousands of ink-wet pages was scattering across the West. The outcome of the struggle was immediate and profound. The articles of treason, signed by Silas Thorne, Marcus Kincaid, and Josephine Hayes, were not merely accusations. They were authenticated, irrefutable proof of a conspiracy that stretched back to the Civil War. 1. The arrest of Kincaid and the miners' justice. The news traveled like wildfire, carried by the telegraph lines that Josephine Hayes had failed to fully shut down, and amplified by the very railroad system she had paralyzed. In Montana, the striking lumber workers at the Flathead Timber Concern, having read the cinder pamphlets, seized the moment. They captured Marcus Kincaid, who had been attempting to flee his besieged mill, not to hang him, but to turn him over to the newly arrived federal marshals. Kincaid's brute force empire dissolved into a whimper. His timberland, his mills, and his rolling stock were immediately impounded by the federal government under the authority of the Military Jurisdiction Act, the very clause Thorne had written into the Articles for security. Kincaid had lost his empire and his freedom. His silence of defeat was the clang of a jail cell door. The fate of Silas Thorne. Thorne, already dead, received the final justice of public condemnation. The investigation confirmed his murder was orchestrated by Hayes's agents. His bank, the Prosperity Exchange, was immediately closed and seized. The assets, the Special Asset Reallocation Fund, were earmarked for restitution. Thorne's silence of defeat was the physical silence of the grave, a final brutal testament to the cost of greed. The only architect of the conspiracy still at large was Josephine Hayes, the unseen hand. She was too intelligent to be caught in the public chaos and too connected to be detained by local police. She had retreated to her fortress in Cheyenne, preparing her final desperate move. Elias, though injured, was now the center of the unfolding federal investigation. Captain Finch, having ridden hard from Fort Keogh after learning of O'Connell's betrayal, arrived with a detachment of troops and federal marshals, establishing order in the city square. "Mr. Vance," Finch said, looking down at the archivist, "the Secretary of War confirms the authenticity of the articles. Every asset is being frozen. Hayes is isolated, but she is still dangerous. We believe she is preparing to flee the country with a substantial portion of her personal liquid assets."
Elias, receiving medical attention from Ada Sterling and the relieved Dr. Reed, pushed through the pain. "She will use the fastest means available, Captain. Her private rail car. It can outrun any police detachment. But the rail lines are a mess after the trestle. She can't get far," Finch countered. "She doesn't need the rail to get far, Captain. She needs it to get out," Elias insisted. "There is a secret, unmarked spur line outside Cheyenne, leading to a private staging post near the Canadian border. It was built with the gunpowder money. Entry 112. She will be there." Elias Vance, the archivist, had one last critical piece of data that the military did not possess. He had a deep personal understanding of the architecture of her betrayal. Captain Finch organized a rapid, multifaceted pursuit. While the main body of marshals secured the major railway junctions, Finch himself, relying on Elias's knowledge, took a small, fast cavalry detachment toward the isolated staging post. Elias, against the fierce protests of Ada, insisted on going. He needed to witness the final outcome, not just for the ledger, but for his own soul. He rode in the lead supply wagon, Chaikin, silent and watchful, riding alongside him. They found Josephine Hayes at the desolate private railhead. Her opulent private carriage, the Silver Quill, was coupled to a powerful, custom-built engine
ready to make a high-speed dash across the unguarded plains. She stood on the platform, dressed in a sweeping traveling cloak, looking like a queen fleeing a coup. She was alone, except for the engineer, who stood beside the engine's cab, rifle in hand. He had chosen loyalty to his paymaster over survival. Hayes saw the approaching dust cloud of the cavalry and smiled, a thin, bitter curve of her lips. Elias Vance, the archivist who became an arsonist, you have destroyed everything I built. A fortune of $50 million, erased by a ledger and a printing press. Finch ordered his men to dismount and surround the carriage. Josephine Hayes, you are under arrest for treason and conspiracy. Surrender now. Hayes held up a small, elegant valise, the final repository of her liquid assets. I am not a soldier, Captain. I am an investor, and my investment in the new world is complete. I choose to leave the table. The true climax of the story arrived in this moment of stillness. It was a test of the syndicate's core philosophy against Elias's moral commitment. Hayes turned her focus entirely to Elias. You think you have vindication, Vance? You think you are the hero? Look around you. You traded the death of distant soldiers for the death of 2 men close to you, and the ruin of thousands of innocent investors. You blew up a trestle. You caused a riot. You are not a cleaner, Elias. You are just a terrorist with a better ledger. She had touched the core of his guilt, the silence of defeat that would forever haunt him. Elias struggled out of the wagon, leaning heavily on Chayton. Your fortune, Hayes, was the terror. My choice was to bring the truth to the light, regardless of the cost. The death of Thorne and the chaos of the city square is the price you exacted, not the price I chose to pay. She scoffed. And the price of the cinder? That old fool, Ada Sterling? She is safe now, I suppose, the true enemy of order. A terrible realization flashed in Elias's mind, a final horrifying piece of the clockwork mechanism. Hayes had been too calm. Hayes smiled, a flicker of triumph finally crossing her face. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a fragment of a Caslin-type lead block, a printing type. The engineer recovered something useful from the destruction, Elias. Not the original contract, but a small piece of lead type and the address of the printing office. I sent an insurance policy to Orem before I left Cheyenne. Elias's blood ran cold. Ada? Ada Sterling's silence is the final victory for order, Elias. If I cannot have my escape, you cannot have your peace. Hayes gave a curt nod to the engineer, who was now in the engine cab. The powerful locomotive began to hiss and steam, ready for departure. Hayes turned to walk to the carriage steps. Captain Finch raised his rifle. Halt! One more step, and I fire. You won't shoot, Captain, she said without looking back. It would be an untidy end for an investor. But the engineer, seeing the impending arrest, pulled a hidden lever in the cab. The engine lurched forward, gaining speed. The final act of defiance was a high-speed dash for the border. The cavalry pursuit began instantly. The soldiers mounted their horses, thundering after the locomotive. Elias, watching the rail car speed away, knew he couldn't allow Hayes to escape and carry out her final vicious act of revenge against Ada Sterling. He grabbed a coil of rope from the wagon. Chayton, we have to catch the engine. She's lying. She's covering her real escape, but she did send an agent to Orem. Chayton, understanding the gravity of the threat to the cinder, didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse, pulling Elias up behind him, the raw speed of the Lakota horsemanship allowing them to overtake the rear of the cavalry line. They found the rear of the private carriage. Chayton matched the speed of the horse to the train, allowing Elias to make a desperate leap onto the coupling between the carriage and the tender. Elias clambered up the back of the coal tender, ignoring the excruciating pain in his leg. He reached the cab, where the engineer was pushing the engine to its maximum speed, ignoring the shouts and shots from the pursuing cavalry. "Stop the train, engineer! Ada Sterling is innocent!" Elias screamed. The engineer turned, his face calm, accepting his ultimate fate. "The syndicate does not tolerate failure, Mr. Vance, and it does not tolerate loose ends." He reached for a final heavy wrench near the control levers. Elias, realizing the man would never surrender, didn't hesitate. He charged, not to fight, but to take control of the engine. The final physical climax was short. Elias and the engineer crashed against the controls. The wrench flew free. Elias, using the knowledge gained from his close observation of the rail yard, wrenched the main brake lever. The huge engine shrieked in protest, its wheels locking and spitting sparks, slowing violently. The abrupt stop sent Elias flying from the cab onto the ballast of the track. The engineer, seeing the carriage rapidly slowing, looked out and saw Captain Finch and the lead cavalry riders closing in. He looked back at Josephine Hayes, standing stunned in her slowing carriage. He made his final, cold, corporate decision. He grabbed a can of engine oil, drenched the cab, and lit a match, throwing it into the firebox. The explosion was small, but contained, ensuring that the engine and the cab were destroyed, preventing any immediate pursuit. The engineer was consumed by the fire, achieving his silence of defeat through his final professional act of corporate sabotage. Hayes watched her final asset burn, then looked at the cavalry surrounding her. She dropped the elegant valise containing her last gold and stepped down onto the tracks, accepting her fate with a cold dignity. "The checkmate is complete, Captain Finch. The archivist wins. But tell him one thing. The corruption of the New World did not begin with the ledger. It began with the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. We simply had the courage to profit from it."
Josephine Hayes, the unseen hand, was formally arrested for treason and conspiracy. Her silence of defeat was the long, heavy walk in chains back to the federal jurisdiction. Elias, watching the arrest from the trackside, the smoke of the burning engine acrid in his lungs, felt the terrible weight lift. He had his vindication. The empires built on the secret debt were shattered, their assets seized, their architects jailed. The Lakota scout, Chayton, helped him up. "The paper is safe, archivist," Chayton said, looking at the distant mountains. "The truth runs free now." Later, recovering from his injury under Ada Sterling's care, Elias learned the final details. Ada was safe. Hayes's last desperate agent had been caught by the local sheriff before reaching Orem. The Cinder, however, never stopped printing. Ada Sterling, using the final printed articles of treason, launched a massive national reform movement. The seized assets were used to fund hospitals, schools, and land reforms across the West. Elias Vance, the archivist, declined any reward. He had his recompense, the knowledge that the ledger was balanced. He spent a year in Orem, meticulously helping Ada document the official history of the conspiracy. His path to redemption was long and scarred, but his final act was one of supreme accountability. The fading echo of the old world had finally been silenced, replaced by the resonant, loud ballad of the anonymous voice, a permanent testament to the truth that had cost so much to uncover. He had failed to save Silas Thorne, but he had, in the end, saved the soul of the West. The aftermath of the struggle was not a triumphant fanfare, but the quiet, agonizing recovery of Elias Vance. He was back in Orem, resting in the small, clean back room of the Sterling Bindery,
the scent of fresh ink and glue a comforting anchor in his turbulent existence. The bolt wound in his leg was severe, binding him to a cot and forcing an immobility that was alien to his recent frantic life. Ada Sterling, the Cinder, was his nurse, his sentinel, and his anchor. She worked tirelessly, tending to his wound, yet never ceasing the work of the press. The rumbling of the ancient Caslon machine in the next room, the relentless turning of the wheel of truth, was a constant reminder that the fight had been won, but the consequences were still unfolding. Elias had achieved vindication. The empires of the syndicate were under lock and key. The names of Thorne, Kincaid, and Hayes were synonymous with infamy, but the victory felt heavy, stained by the violence and loss he had witnessed and in part caused. The unwritten history weighed heavily on Elias's conscience, far more heavily than the physical pain of his leg. The truth of the merchant's ledger was now public, but the narrative of Elias Vance, the archivist turned saboteur, remained deeply private, held only by Ada, Chayton, and Captain Finch. Loss of innocence. The deepest consequence was the death of Caleb Thorne. Caleb, the young clerk who wanted a clean life, had paid the ultimate price for his cousin's sins, dying a martyr to the cause of truth. Ada arranged a small private memorial for Caleb near the bindery. Elias, propped up on crutches, was the only non-family mourner. Chayton, always the distant observer, stood guard at the perimeter. The simplicity of the service, the quiet commitment to an idealism crushed by corporate malice, struck Elias hard. He had used Caleb's trust as a strategic advantage. That was the unwritten truth that burned hotter than any fever. Loss of trust. Captain Finch visited frequently, bringing updates from the federal investigation. The captain was a man of the rigid military code, and his gratitude toward Elias was mixed with a chilling professional distance. The Military Jurisdiction Act allowed us to move swiftly, Mr. Vance, Finch reported one afternoon, carefully stepping around the ink-stained floor. Kincaid is awaiting trial. Hayes is in custody in a secure federal prison. But the official report, Mr. Vance, must be clean. Clean? Elias asked, knowing where this was heading. The official record states that an anonymous informant, likely Silas Thorne's distressed cousin, provided a military officer with the documents. The officer delivered them to the proper authorities. Your name, the trestle sabotage, the procurement of the tracking beacon. That history is too complex, too difficult to explain to Congress. It muddies the waters. Elias nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of bureaucratic necessary. The weight of unwritten history was the lie the government needed to tell to preserve its own legitimacy. The true story of the revolution, the desperate, law-breaking acts, the violence, the test of the empty chamber, would be erased to fit the convenient narrative of a seamless, self-correcting federal system. The weight of redemption. His redemption was to be anonymous, a ghost in the machine he had fixed. The core of the unwritten history lay in the decision of how to document the revolution itself. Ada Sterling wanted the entire, raw truth. They will turn you into a footnote, Elias, Ada argued one evening, sharpening the edges of a newly bound book. They will make the people believe the system fixed itself. That is the syndicate's final victory, control over the narrative. But the people have the articles, Ada. They have the facts, Elias countered, running his finger over the rough wood of his cot. Facts are nothing without context, Elias. You know that better than anyone. Why did you risk your life for Caleb Thorne's papers? Why did you destroy the trestle? The official record will call you a simple fugitive. It will never record the moral accounting of the merchant's ledger. This was the final, profound dilemma of the archivist. the choice between documented truth and functional truth. Documented truth, the ledger's way, to record every detail, every compromise, every violent act, including his own moral failures. This would satisfy his debt, but it would compromise the federal investigation and perhaps lead to a counter-narrative that dismissed the expose as the work of an unstable extremist. Functional truth, the Cinder's way, to record the necessary truth, the treason, the corruption, the final victory, while allowing his own complex, compromised role to remain in the shadows. This would protect the integrity of the reforms, but leave his personal history perpetually unwritten. One rainy afternoon, Elias made his decision. He pulled the blank, replacement leather-bound book Ada had given him, a symbolic heir to the destroyed merchant's ledger, onto his lap. He decided that the official history was not his domain, but his personal history was. He began to write, addressing the true, unseen audience of his work, the memory of the dead. He started not with the arrests, but with the quiet scene in Cayenne, in the look in Caleb Thorne's eyes before he was captured. He documented the cold rationale of the clockwork mechanism of betrayal and the terrifying stillness of Josephine Hayes. He recorded the full context of his flight, the desperation, and the silent guiding strength of Chayton, the Lakota scout who understood the land's true morality better than any civilized man. He wrote with the agonizing honesty of a confession about the test of the empty chamber. I had the means to take a life, and in that moment of ultimate tension, I willed the act. I was prepared to cross the final unforgivable line. Fate intervened, leaving the chamber empty, reminding me that my tool was the pen, not the bullet. The blood shed in that alley belongs to the syndicate, but the choice belonged to me. My hands remain clean of blood, but not of guilt. The ledger remains unbalanced in this regard. He wrote for weeks, transforming the fragmented, violent reality of his journey into a coherent, personal testament. It was his final act of accounting, a complete, unsparing history of not the syndicate's treason, but the archivist's redemption.
When the last page was filled, Elias handed the book, sealed with wax, to Ada. This is not for print, Ada. Not now, not ever, unless history loses its way again. It is my true ledger. It contains the cost, the compromises, and the full weight of the truth. It is the unwritten history that must remain a secret to protect the functional history we gave the people. Ada, reading the final pages of his self-confession, nodded, her eyes shining with quiet understanding. The sender understands. The anonymous voice often requires the sacrifice of personal fame. The truth lives. The author remains a ghost. She had achieved her vengeance through publication. He had achieved his through private documentation. Chayton, before departing back to the wilderness, visited Elias one last time. He saw the new book, the new ledger, and understood its significance. The paper you carried was heavy, archivist, Chayton said, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. But the story you write now is heavier. The land remembers. When the last page was filled, Elias handed the book, sealed with wax, to Ada. This is not for print, Ada. Not now, not ever, unless history loses its way again. It is my true ledger. It contains the cost, the compromises, and the full weight of the truth. It is the unwritten history that must remain a secret to protect the functional history we gave the people. Ada, reading the final pages of his self-confession, nodded, her eyes shining with quiet understanding. The cinder understands. The anonymous voice often requires the sacrifice of personal fame. The truth lives. The author remains a ghost. She had achieved her vengeance through publication. He had achieved his through private documentation. Chayton, before departing back to the wilderness, visited Elias one last time. He saw the new book, the new ledger, and understood its significance. "The paper you carried was heavy, archivist," Chayton said, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "But the story you write now is heavier. The land remembers, even if the white man's history forgets. You gave the land its voice back." Elias Vance, the former archivist, chose the silence of defeat for himself, the perpetual anonymity that guaranteed the lasting vindication for the public. He did not return to the city. He did not testify publicly. He remained in Orem, working side by side with Ada Sterling, helping her turn the official court documents and Kincaid's seized records into accessible educational pamphlets for the citizens. He became the true, unseen chronicler of the New West, the silent, dedicated guardian of the printed word, forever laboring under the weight of unwritten history. The secret debt was paid, and the ledger was balanced, not with gold, but with the quiet, persistent truth. 2 years had passed since the downfall of the syndicate and the subsequent federal intervention that reshaped the economic map of the Western Territories. The vindication had held firm. Josephine Hayes was serving a long sentence for fraud and conspiracy, her trial carefully managed by the War Department to minimize the explosive details of the treason clause. Marcus Kincaid, the timber baron, found his power utterly gone, serving time on lesser charges, his silence bought with the promise of parole. The most visible legacy of the events was the creation of the Federal Western Land Trust, funded by the liquidated assets of the syndicate. The trust oversaw the fair distribution of seized lands and financed public works, a quiet, bureaucratic testament to the truth brought forth by the press. Elias Vance was no longer the bruised, anxious fugitive. He was a man defined by a profound internal stillness. He lived in Orem, the small town that housed the Cinder. His leg had healed, leaving him with a slight limp, a physical reminder of the test of the empty chamber. He maintained his silent partnership with Ada Sterling. He was the ghost in the machine, the meticulous editor and fact-checker who ensured that every pamphlet, every public report issued by the Cinder, now a highly respected, legitimate watchdog publication, was unassailable. He was the archivist who finally understood the true power of the written word. His only personal possession of value was the heavy, leather-bound book he had filled, his private, unwritten history, detailing the true cost and the moral compromises of the reckoning. It remained sealed, hidden in a lockbox beneath the floorboards of the bindery. The final scene of Elias's journey was not set in a city square, but in the wilderness, the silent landscape that had both hunted and protected him. Elias traveled alone, riding a steady mule high into the pine-scented mountains. He was heading back to the remnants of Marcus Kincaid's empire, the vast, sprawling forests that had been the first resource stolen and the first to be recovered by the land trust. He reached a remote, high valley where the forest was dense and the air was thin and clean. This was the place where he had first encountered Kincaid's brutality, and where, months earlier, the Red Rock Trestle had stood before its catastrophic fall. The trestle was gone, replaced by a temporary smaller bridge built by the federal workers. But the surrounding mountains, cloaked in towering, ancient pines, were the true, eternal witnesses. Only the pines remember. Elias stopped his mule and dismounted. The silence here was different from the silence of the printing room. It was vast, deep, and utterly indifferent to the rise and fall of human ambition. He was here for a final private accounting. Elias walked slowly to a clearing overlooking the sheer drop where the trestle had once spanned the canyon. He sat on a smooth granite rock, pulling a small canvas sack from his pack. Inside were 2 items, a clean, polished silver locket that had belonged to Caleb Thorne, and a heavy, tarnished lead type block, salvaged from the debris of the final confrontation, a symbol of the press that had saved him. The lasting change in Elias was the integration of his 2 selves, the rigid archivist and the desperate revolutionary. He had learned that justice required both the meticulous truth of the ledger and the brutal force of action. He was no longer running from his past, but carrying its weight with quiet strength. He held the locket, a small tangible memory of the innocent loss. He had sent Caleb's personal effects back to his distant family, but he had kept the locket as his personal penance. I used your idealism, Caleb. I used your death as a hammer to strike the final blow. Your innocence was the cost of the functional truth. He dug a small, shallow hole beneath the granite rock and gently placed the silver locket into the earth. It was a final private burial for the innocence he had traded for the victory. The legacy of the events. The second object, the lead type block, represented the victory and the legacy. It was the weight of the printed word, the silent weapon that had toppled an empire. He thought of Josephine Hayes, still denying the treason, still believing her corporate empire was a superior form of law. He thought of the citizens who had seized the truth and used it to reclaim their land. The legacy of the events was not the arrest of the syndicate, which was merely the surface. The real legacy was the profound, subtle change in the structure of belief across the territories. The people no longer trusted the surface appearance of prosperity. They looked deeper, guided by the constant, questioning voice of the cinder. Elias held the lead tight, feeling its cold, solid weight. He remembered the feeling of the empty chamber, the moment fate had decided his morality. He had learned that the most powerful force in the West was not the iron horse, but the quiet, persistent engine of truth, fueled by Ada Sterling's conviction and his own data. He placed the lead-type block in the same hole, burying it with the locket. The tools of the trade, the cost and the victory, were laid to rest together. Only the pines remember, Elias whispered to the wind. They remember the corruption of the wood and the integrity of the granite. The debt is settled. He stood, looking at the distant plume of smoke rising from a small local train, a train now running under the purview of the new federal trust, carrying supplies to the land reform settlements. The rail was no longer a symbol of tyranny, but a tool for equitable growth. Elias mounted his mule. His change was complete. He was no longer Elias Vance, the archivist of the old world, nor was he the revolutionary fugitive. He was the guardian of the New West's memory.
He knew that the fight would never truly end. There would always be new men eager to exploit the land, new shadows cast by corporate greed. But now there was a mechanism to fight them, the vigilance of the people, guided by the persistence of the cinder. He returned to Orem, to the steady, comforting rumble of the press. He entered the bindery and found Ada, her spectacles perched on her nose, surrounded by stacks of paper. "Welcome back, Elias," Ada said, not looking up. "I've just finished setting the type for the new edition. We received documents detailing a significant discrepancy in the grazing permits near the northern border. It seems a new syndicate is trying to acquire land through fraudulent means." Elias smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines around his eyes. He walked to his desk, picked up a pen, and pulled the first of the official records toward him. "Good," Elias said, the familiar authority returning to his voice. "Let's begin the audit, Ada. We have a lot of history to write." He was home. His legacy was the continuous, quiet work of accountability. The weight of unwritten history was no longer a burden of guilt, but the simple, unyielding commitment to the truth. Day after day, page after page.